Chapter 500. Chen Pingping was silent for a moment. He then said, "The emperor is a suspicious person. The method Fan Xian used cannot be said to be unintelligent, but the problem is that the emperor is suspicious. So, for these easily seen points of suspicion, it will instead create deeper suspicions." Fei Jie glanced at him and said, "That is why we have to help Fan Xian kill people and solidify these suspicions." "Yes." Chen Pingping smiled slightly and said, "The emperor is suspicious, so it is difficult for him to make a decision. After all these years, he is no longer the fierce general who dared to use 500 people to charge at the Northern Wei Iron Riders. Killing people to calm the emperor's heart, although it is crude, is good. Dead people can't speak, but the dead can tell the emperor what the emperor wants to know." Fei Jie coughed and said, "Although it is a bit troublesome to explain, I understand basically." Chen Pingping smiled. "The emperor is suspicious and confident. Once he suspects something, he will only look to the evidence in front of him to find the part that can prove his suspicions, so, in the end, it is just the emperor deceiving his own eyes. Of course, from a certain point of view, this cannot be considered deceiving because this is something that actually happened." As they spoke, faint voices came from outside Qin Garden. Chen Pingping and Fei Jie met each other's eyes. Chen Pingping said, "Looks like the palace's edict has arrived. Prepare to leave the capital." Fei Jie nodded and then asked, "Where is Hong Zhu?" "Don't move for now." Chen Pingping furrowed his brows and thought for a moment. He then pushed the wheelchair toward the garden and said, "I keep on feeling that this little eunuch is not simple." Far away in Jiangnan, Fan Xian, who thought he was watching everything in Jingdo with the cold eye of a bystander, did not know that the nail he had buried the deepest in the royal palace had, at the same time, become the target that the two most powerful figures in Qin Kingdom wanted to kill. This only proved that he was not a god. Accurately speaking, this plan that had consumed the most of his energy and was the most deeply hidden still had many dangers that were completely outside of his calculations. If it was not for Hong Zhu's good enough luck, by the time Fan Xian returned to the capital next time, he would probably not be able to find any news of that pimple-covered little eunuch in this world. He didn't know if there were gods in the temple, but there was certainly no one in this world who was a god. Even the Northern Qi imperial advisor Ku He, whose realm was closest to that of a god, and the Qing emperor, whose power and state of mind were enough to make even a god jealous, were still mortals. Thus, the Qing emperor, who had always appeared unfathomable, was now sitting in the long corridor of Taiji Palace. As he looked at the vast expanse of palaces in front of him, his gaze appeared lonely and disappointed, just like a normal middle-aged man. Beside the emperor was the black wheelchair. Chen Pingping lowered his head and gently stroked the wool blanket on his knees. He was silent. The ruler and minister were silent, calmly looking at the palace field in front of them. It was still the beginning of spring. There were no fallen leaves or flowers. The palace had been swept clean by the eunuchs, palace maids, and servants. There was not a speck of dust. The dirt in the gaps between the stone slabs was flat, forming lines of modesty. At this time, it was already very late at night, but the lanterns in Taiji Palace still illuminated the palace field clearly. I was wrong. The emperor did not refer to himself as emperor today. He sighed and said, "I always thought that after 3 northern expeditions, western expeditions, and southern expeditions, there was nothing in this world that I could not endure. Thus, I could calmly watch all of this happen. However, when it truly happened, I found that I had overestimated my endurance." Chen Pingping glanced at him and quietly said, "This is a family matter. The ancients have said that it is difficult for even an upright official to resolve family matters. Your Majesty is no exception." Chen Pingping already knew exactly what had happened in the palace, but this old cripple did not purposely show any shock or fear. His attitude was very calm, as if this matter was not a big deal. This kind of attitude made the emperor's mood a little better. Yes, it was just a family matter that could not see the light of day. The Emperor changed his way of addressing himself back and smiled slightly. In the past, you always said that you didn't want to participate in my family matters, but in the end, you still did. What do you think? Do you want to help me handle this matter? Chen Pingping lowered his head even more and said, Your Majesty has long made a brilliant decision. I only need to act according to the plan. The Emperor was silent for a long time. He then slowly said, A few months ago, I told you here that I was prepared to play with them. However, she is, after all, my favorite sister. Those little brats are, after all, my sons. Thus, I have always found it hard to bear. Now, even if I can't bear it, I have to act. Chen Pingping slowly raised his head. His expression did not change, but a strange emotion gradually filled the depths of his heart. In order to make the Emperor make up his mind, he had already done so many things and waited for so long. Finally, he had waited for the moment the Emperor opened his mouth. You are outside the palace. I am inside. The Qing Emperor slowly closed his eyes. That night, the 13 city gate guards in Jingdo received an order from the palace and an intelligence report approved by the Overwatch Council. The opening of the Jingdo city gates was delayed by an hour. The morning light shone brightly. The villagers preparing to enter the city carried fruits, vegetables, and meat and formed a long line outside the city gates. Their faces were full of confusion and confusion. There was rarely a precedent of delaying the opening of the city gates in Jingdo. According to the reports of the soldiers in front, last night, a Dongyi spy had tried to sneak into the Overwatch Council. Thus, there was a large-scale search going on in Jingdo. In order to prevent the spy from escaping the city, the 13 city gate guards were heavily guarded. The commoners immediately calmed down. No one had any more complaints. They only cursed the reckless Dongyi spies in a low voice. In Jingdo, the Overwatch Council, personally overseen by Chen Pingping, had begun to move in the early hours of the morning. The director had been in Chen Garden for a few years. The Overwatch Council was under Fan Xian's direct command. Once he took back the authority of the Overwatch Council, the speed and secrecy of the Overwatch Council's actions immediately returned to a terrifying level. In less than 2 hours, the Overwatch Council had already secretly taken control of 4 manors. The Jingdo garrison did not receive any news. The soldiers on night patrol stared dumbfoundedly at the black-robed Overwatch Council officials busily walking around. They hurriedly reported to their superiors, not knowing what had happened in Jingdo. The thousands of imperial soldiers surrounding the royal palace also did not move. They only quietly guarded the royal palace's gates. The commander of the Jingdo garrison, who had just been promoted by the Qing emperor, was a general who had followed the great prince on the western expedition the year before. Hearing his subordinates report, he randomly put on his clothes and rushed out of the palace. However, he only saw an unusually calm palace with nothing out of the ordinary. The sleepy-eyed eunuch Ho stood behind the imperial soldiers with a group of guards. Coldly, he refused the commander's request to enter the palace to report. Before long, the great prince, who was still sleeping in Prince Heching's manor, also rode in. Even his request to enter the palace was calmly and firmly refused by eunuch Ho. The great prince and the commander of the garrison met each other's eyes. They both saw the unease and wariness in each other's hearts. At this time, the sky had not yet brightened. Dark clouds floated over high in the sky, enveloping Jingdo even darker. The secret agents and officials of the Overwatch Council had all begun to move. However, these 2 major figures responsible for the Jingdo garrison had no idea what had happened. The commander of the Jingdo garrison carefully glanced at the great prince and said, "Commander, should we go to the Overwatch Council and ask?" In the Western Expedition Army, this commander was the great prince's deputy general, so he was still used to calling him commander. The great prince paused for a moment and then slapped his forehead in annoyance. The Overwatch Council had come out in full force. It must have been an edict from the palace. Furthermore, the person in charge was certainly Director Chen. Other people didn't dare to ask Director Chen face to face, but what was he afraid of? A moment later, the two of them led their guards into the Overwatch Council through the royal palace gates. When they entered the courtyard, they were not stopped. In the garden, they saw the old cripple by the shallow pool. "Director, what happened?" The great prince looked at Chen Pingping and asked straightforwardly. Chen Pingping did not raise his head and said, "It's nothing. Last night, an ace from Dongyi snuck into the council and stole a great deal of valuable intelligence. I entered the capital overnight and went into the palace to ask for help. At this time, I am searching all over the city." The great prince furrowed his brows. He knew that this was a lie. What kind of spy would enter the capital and disturb Chen Pingping? Would it even cause the royal palace's gates to close? The commander of the Jingdo garrison respectfully asked, "Director, what do you need the Jingdo garrison's cooperation?" "Xiesu." Chen Pingping glanced at the commander of the Jingdo garrison and sighed. "You haven't been in office for long. You have to quickly grasp the Jingdo garrison in your hand. Presently, you only have this position, but you can't even move the soldiers under you. How can you cooperate?" Commander Xie Su's mouth tasted bitter. He knew that Director Chen was speaking the truth. The Jingdo garrison had first been controlled by the Yi family for 20 years. Later, it was managed by the second young master of the Qin family. The Yi and Qin families had stuffed countless trusted aides into the Jingdo garrison. Given the status of these two families in the military, it was indeed too difficult for him, an outsider of the Western Expedition Army, to completely control it. The great prince asked worriedly, "Uncle Chen, tell me the truth. Is the matter big? Why are the palace gates closed?" "It's a small matter," Chen Pingping calmly said. "I only need an hour. There won't be any problems." "Oh right." He sat in his wheelchair and said, "The Emperor has decreed that today's court meeting will be delayed by an hour. Go to the various manors to prevent Shu Wu and those old fellows waiting outside the palace for too long and cursing." Another hour passed. The great prince was deeply worried, but he knew that before the matter was over, Director Chen would not tell him the truth. In the end, Chen Pingping said, however, "There are a few manors that you don't need to send the message. My people have already gone." The people of the Overwatch Council had already been sent out to the Lotus Pond Square, where the commoners lived. With the cooperation of the Jingdo government, they captured a group of ruthless men who were still sleeping. Although the Jianghu people did their best to resist, in the end, after paying the price of a dozen corpses, they had no choice but to lower their heads and be tied with black rope. Another group of people from the Overwatch Council came to the manors of a few imperial censors and very roughly pressed these imperial censors, who were renowned for their iron bones, to the ground. They had no fear of being swept to the ground and directly escorted them to the Supreme Court. There was a wave of terror and crying in the manors of the imperial censors. Among the Overwatch Council group, a young man with a black hat covering his face furrowed his brows and said to the head of the first bureau, Mu Tai, beside him, "Sir Mu, these are, after all, imperial censors. Even the emperor is tolerant of them. Rumor has it that they are not guilty of discussing matters. For you to randomly arrest them like this, are you not afraid that it will damage the emperor's clean reputation?" "Sir He, you are now the imperial censor," Mu Tai said respectfully. "As for how to deal with the aftermath, it will all be up to you." This person was He Zongwei, the imperial censor the Qing emperor had inserted into the Overwatch Council during the last change of blood. No one knew what Chen Pingping was thinking to have him follow the Overwatch Council and participate in the operation against the imperial censor. He Zongwei huffed coldly. He knew that if he appeared after daybreak and cooperated with the Overwatch Council to throw this group of imperial censors into prison, his reputation would be completely ruined. However, he was also a clever person. He knew that the early morning operation was the palace's idea. He gradually realized that this was the only power the emperor could rely on to wipe out the eldest princess. Thus, he didn't dare have any objections. He was only confused. Jingdo had been peaceful for a while. Why would the emperor suddenly not tolerate the eldest princess? The third Overwatch Council group was currently in the Yen Manor. With a cold expression, Yen Bingyun held the council order in his hand and looked at Yen Hangshu kneeling in front of him. Slowly and firmly, he read out the crimes of the Minister of Appointments, Yen Hangshu. Each and every one of them was a heinous crime that struck deeply into people's hearts. Yen Hangshu, whose clothes were disheveled, knelt on the ground. When he heard these charges, his body became weak. He knew that if it was not a critical moment, the emperor would not use these charges to punish him, a minister. Since these charges were thrown out, it meant that the emperor really wanted to kill him. Why? There was only one reason. These years, he had been too close to the eldest princess. Yen Hangshu thought sorrowfully in his heart, but he still wailed in despair, "I want to see the emperor's order. I want to see the order. The Overwatch Council does not have an order. You cannot interrogate third-level officials." Yen Bingyun glanced at him and shook his head. He took out the order and waved it in front of his eyes. Yen Hangshu, the dignified minister of the Ministry of Appointments, felt his vision darken. He had actually fainted from the shock of this letter. There were still a few more groups of Overwatch Council officials moving. Because the time they chose was early in the morning, when everything was quiet, most of the Jingdo officials and elders were asleep, so the operation proceeded smoothly. In less than an hour, most of the officials in Jingdo, who were too deeply involved with the eldest princess, had been invited back to the Overwatch Council's Celestial Prison or the Supreme Court's Straw Hut. The last group of Overwatch Council officials waited patiently outside a quiet manor. They had already surrounded this manor for a long time and still hadn't moved. They were waiting for reports from various places. This group of officials did not have a leader, nor did they carry an edict with them. There wasn't even a council order personally signed by Chen Pingping. Their composition was the simplest. They were all people of the 6th Bureau. They didn't need to enter the manor to pass on the edict. The edict they received was that once they entered the manor, they were strictly forbidden from talking to anyone in the manor, and they were to kill everyone. On a normal day, the sky should have already begun to brighten. Today, the dark clouds were too thick and the sky was still dark. With a head of messy hair, Fei Jie walked out from the corner of the street beside the manor. He nodded to the 6th Bureau assassins surrounding the manor and left. The 6th Bureau assassins swarmed in, but they didn't meet any resistance. They knew that this manor hid the eldest princess' most powerful martial power, most secret intelligence, most trusted confidants, and most yet, there was no resistance. All of the Xinyang aces were still asleep when they were knocked unconscious by the poison Fei Jie had laid down. Occasionally, a few aces with profound internal strength would immediately return to the underworld under the 6th Bureau swordsmen's knives and swords and fall into an eternal slumber. The first courtyard of the manor was filled with dead people. The chief strategist of Xinyang, Huang Yi, looked at the 6th Bureau swordsman charging through the door with a face full of despair. A few days ago, this strategist had been nearly killed by Fan Xian's poison. Now, he had been poisoned by Fan Xian's teacher again. He had long since lost any chance to retaliate. He just couldn't accept it. His mind hadn't been of sufficient use. In the history of the Qin kingdom, he hadn't left a single trace, yet he was going to die. An ice-cold sword cut off his train of thought and pierced his throat, killing him. Entering the rear courtyard, the 6th Bureau swordsmen didn't give the young and beautiful men any chance to beg for mercy. Using great speed, they killed them and then began to take care of the bodies. Chapter 501. Before the sky brightened, The shaken Yuan Hongdao followed a small alley in the west of the city and fled toward the Lotus Pond Square. He was careful along the way, avoiding the Overwatch Council's pursuit and the Jingdo garrison's patrols. With great difficulty, he came to a private house. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and sat woodenly by the table. Dumbfounded, he couldn't speak for a long time. In his life, he had done countless major things. He had even personally brought down the previous prime minister. However, the scene in the early hours of the morning still shook him to the core. Presumably, everyone in the eldest princess manor was dead. From a certain point of view, these people were all killed by Yuan Hongdao. The problem was, in everyone's understanding, Yuan Hongdao was a trusted aide by the eldest princess side. If he hadn't escaped earlier, he would probably have been killed on the spot by the swordsman of the 6th Bureau. If Fei Jie hadn't acted first. This private house was one of the Overwatch Council's most secretive transfer stations. Yuan Hongdao turned his head and saw a cup of tea on the table. Without hesitation, he drank it to moisten his dry throat. "Aren't you afraid there's poison in the tea?" A middle-aged man walked out from the inner room with a slight smile. It was Sir Yen Jr.'s father, the previous commander of the 4th Bureau, Yen Ruohai. Yuan Hongdao glanced at him warily. After confirming the other party's identity, he quietly said, "I never had any hope of continuing to live." In the eyes of this most successful spy in the Qin kingdom, this half-hour arrest in the early hours of the morning already showed that the emperor could no longer tolerate the eldest princess. Furthermore, he believed that given the emperor and Director Chen's ability to move, the eldest princess side would be cleaned out in just an hour. If the eldest princess no longer posed any threat, then the traces of his existence as a spy would be erased. However, Yuan Hongdao did not feel a glimmer of sorrow. From the moment he began to follow Lin Ruofu many years ago, he had been prepared to sacrifice himself for the Qin kingdom at any time. However, Yen Ruohai only smiled and took out all the procedures and disguises he had prepared for him. He said, "You have not been in the council for a long time. Perhaps you do not know, but the emperor and the director have never easily abandoned any of their subordinates." Yen Ruohai was slightly startled before he smiled bitterly. At this moment, another woman in civilian clothes came in from the back door with a panicked expression on her face. When the woman saw Yuan Hongdao's face clearly, she couldn't help but open her mouth wide in astonishment, as if she had never imagined that Yuan Hongdao would appear here. Yuan Hongdao was also incomparably shocked, because he had once seen this woman in Xinyang. At that time, this woman's identity was that of the eldest princess' trusted palace maid, so this palace maid was actually one of the emperor's people. Yen Ruohai glanced at the palace maid and said with a frown, "You came out a bit late." The palace maid lowered her head and reported, "Last night, just as I left, Eunuch Hong personally went out and surrounded Guangxin Palace. I didn't dare to walk around casually, so I was slow." Yen Ruohai glanced at the two of them and said, "Both of you have rendered meritorious service to the imperial court. His Majesty and the headmaster are very satisfied with your performances over the years. Today's matter is urgent, so we have no choice but to have the two of you meet face to face. This is to prevent you from not knowing each other's identities in the future and bringing unnecessary losses." Without too many superfluous words, Yen Ruohai gave some instructions and began to send the Overwatch Council's two most successful spies out of Jingdo. Yuan Hongdao furrowed his brows and said, "Where are we going?" "You return to Xinyang," Yen Ruohai said each word clearly. "Wait in Xinyang." Yuan Hongdao couldn't believe his ears. He raised his head and asked, "You are saying the eldest princess will return to Xinyang?" "Just in case," Yen Ruohai said quietly. "No one can say for sure about royal matters. As for how to explain it after we return to Xinyang, I will slowly tell you." He then turned his head to the palace maid and said, "Stay hidden in the capital. If there are any changes in the future, you will still need to enter the palace." Finally, this already nominally retired high-ranking official of the Overwatch Council bowed sincerely to Yuan Hongdao and the palace maid and said, "Thank you for your hard work." The room quieted down. Yen Ruohai looked at the wall outside the window and thought of the colleague who had just left. He furrowed his brows slightly. No one knew what he was thinking. After a long time, he smiled. Given the eldest princess's power and shrewdness, the Overwatch Council only needed an hour to dig out her hidden power in Jingdo and use the fastest speed and most thunderous methods to clean it all up. It seemed so easy and at ease. It was completely inconsistent with the people's assessment of the eldest princess's reverence. The Overwatch Council had long buried 2 spies at the eldest princess's side. In particular, the spy, Yuan Hongdao, had been arranged to be at Scholar Lin's side when the eldest princess had taken a liking to the handsome scholar in the imperial examinations. If it was said that the palace maid had only grasped some of the eldest princess's personality and likes and had arranged for Hong Zhu to, coincidentally, discover that shady matter, Yuan Hongdao was now a Xinyang strategist. He was well aware of the eldest princess's power and goals. With such a person secretly helping the Overwatch Council send messages, how could the eldest princess's side stand up to the Overwatch Council's wind and rain? The reason Chen Pingping had never seen the eldest princess as an enemy worthy of attention and the reason the Overwatch Council's attack appeared so accurate and ruthless was all because of this. Yuan Hongdao was the first basket of spies the Overwatch Council had thrown out when it was first established. After so many years of wear and tear in court and under heaven, he was the only one left in that basket of spies. However, he did not know that the present Overwatch Council was no longer the Overwatch Council of the past. Chen Pingping had long coldly stood between these people and the emperor. This was what it meant to be a figurehead. Everything was for the Qin kingdom. This was the obsession in these people's hearts. In reality, everything for them had to be arranged by Chen Pingping. While the sky was still dark, in the large manor, the old man who liked to grow cabbage had already risen from bed and was using a wooden ladle to water the ground. The military's most virtuous and respected elder, the old Qin master, was old, so he woke up earlier than other people. His second son also woke up early. Qin Heng, who was now the deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs but had been forced to leave the Jingdo garrison, rushed over from the front garden with a face full of worry. He had a carelessly thin jacket draped over his body. He moved closer to his old father's ear and quietly said something. Although he was no longer the commander of the Jingdo garrison, the Qin family had many eyes and ears in the military. At the first instant, he knew of the strange movements in Jingdo and the Overwatch Council's actions. The old Qin master furrowed his brows slightly. A glimmer of surprise appeared on his old face. The emperor is attacking the eldest princess. Why? No one knew why the Qing emperor would suddenly attack after being quiet for so long, particularly when the eldest princess had behaved so obediently these few months. What should we do? Qin Heng asked worriedly. If the emperor's actions today were only the beginning of a large operation, then who would be the unlucky ones next? We don't need to do anything. The old Qin master sighed. Do you want to rebel? You shouldn't even ask such a question. But, the eldest princess knows some things about our family. The old Qin master smiled coldly and said, What things? The Ming family's shares or the Jiaozhou navy? Your cousin is handling the Jiaozhou side. There won't be anything that can be used against us in the palace. As for the Ming family, the emperor won't burn my old bones for 10% of the shares. But, Qin Heng was still worried. If the eldest princess loses power today, and we don't act in the future, Fan Xian's faction will dominate the court. I am very worried about what Fan Xian will do in the future. The old Qin master furrowed his brows tightly and said, What matters is whether or not Li Yunrui can survive today. You're saying that the emperor will order the eldest princess to die? Qin Heng's eyes widened. He couldn't believe his ears. How could the Empress Dowager allow such a thing to happen? Is the Emperor not afraid that the court will fall into chaos? The old Qin master laughed coldly and said, "If I were the Emperor, I would either not move against a crazy character like the eldest princess, or I would kill her. However, you're right. There is still the Empress Dowager in the palace. The Emperor is also a ruler who cherishes his reputation, so Li Yunrui may not die. If Li Yunrui dies, nothing we do will be of use." The old Qin master threw the wooden dipper to the ground. "If she can luckily survive, we can't do anything right now, believe me. As long as she can survive, her future counterattack will be very crazy. At that time we will have a chance." The palace doors were tightly shut. The bronze nails on the doors were like the protruding eyes of a ghost, staring at the people outside the palace walls with worried expressions. There were not many people waiting for news outside the palace. It was mainly the great prince and the commander of the Jingdo garrison, Xiesu, and a group of people. They looked at the tightly shut palace doors and didn't know what was happening inside. They already knew that the Overwatch Council had already captured all of the high-ranking officials on the eldest princess side and sent them to the Supreme Court. The great prince's brows were furrowed tightly. A moment later, he suddenly said, "No, I have to go into the palace and admonish." Xiesu carefully pulled on his sleeve and lowered his voice. "Commander, don't be silly. Don't be foolish, this isn't the time for us officials to speak." The great prince furrowed his brows and said, "I can't just watch as this happens. What about grandmother?" The Qing Empress Dowager was still lying high in Hanguang Palace, sleeping soundly. The transmission of information inside and outside of Hanguang Palace had already been cut off by people the Qing Emperor had sent to ensure that no one from another palace would disturb the Empress Dowager's rest or tell her what was happening in some palace. Not far from Hanguang Palace, Guangxin Palace was the palace where the Empress Dowager's favorite daughter, the eldest princess of Qin Kingdom, Li Yunrui, currently lived. Guangxin Palace was different from its usual quiet and beautiful scene. An old eunuch with a hunched back stood in front of Guangxin Palace's door like a withered tree in winter. With the withered tree here, there was nothing left of the quiet scene. The eldest princess, Li Yunrui, stood outside the threshold of Guangxin Palace and looked coldly at the old eunuch outside the palace. "Eunuch Hong, I want to see mother." Eunuch Hong didn't speak. No one else replied. The eunuchs who had followed him to Guangxin Palace were busy in the palace, busily moving bodies from every corner of Guangxin Palace. The 27 serving girls in Guangxin Palace, including the eldest princess's personal serving girls who were skilled in martial arts, were all dead. A few bodies were at the base of the wall outside the palace. It was clear that they had intended to climb over the wall to ask for help. However, since old eunuch Hong had personally brought people here, the serving girls in Guangxin Palace had no ability to fight back. They were all tragically killed. No one even had time to say a word. No one wanted to hear them speak. The emperor's order was clear. No one was allowed to speak. They were all to be killed. The eunuchs carried the bodies of the serving girls onto a few broken carriages and then headed toward the burning field. Along the way, blood flowed down from the empty boards of the carriages and dripped onto the stone path inside the royal palace. It appeared particularly shocking. A eunuch with a broom in his hand pulled a cart of yellow dirt behind him. As he sprinkled the dirt on the blood, he swept it clean. A moment later, the carriages were far away. The blood and dust on the stone path gradually faded and turned into very shallow marks. It was as if there was nothing there at all. Only now did old eunuch Hong slowly raise his head and weakly say, "Your Highness, the Empress Dowager is currently resting. The Emperor doesn't want you to disturb her. Please wait a moment. The Emperor will come to see you in a moment." A glimmer of hatred flashed through the eldest princess's clear and beautiful eyes. Her hands, which hung by her side, slowly tightened. A moment later, she smiled and bowed slightly with great politeness. "Then I will wait here for Brother Emperor." After saying this, she turned and entered the palace, closing the wooden door. Eunuch Hong's body was still bent like a withered tree, silently standing guard outside Guangxin Palace. Although the branches of this tree had no leaves, it gave people the feeling that it was beginning to spread around Guangxin Palace. It wrapped around the top and bottom of the palace, making it difficult for the woman in the palace to breathe. The Eastern Palace was a mess of noise and chaos. Everyone was terrified and uneasy. The Empress, who had come out without any jewelry, looked at the eunuchs who had entered without an invitation and flew into a rage. Her brows furrowed and she cursed loudly, "You dog servants! Do you want to rebel?" Eunuch Yao bowed respectfully and gently said, "Your Highness, I don't dare. It is just that I have the Emperor's orders and have no choice but to obey." At this moment, the pale-faced crown prince also walked out from the back of the palace. He looked at the eunuchs and guards in the palace. His pupils constricted slightly. He found that the people who had come were all his father's absolute trusted aides from Taiji Palace and the royal study. He didn't know what had happened for these servants to break into the Eastern Palace to make trouble, but he knew that this was his father's intention. But why was that? The crown prince forcefully suppressed the fear in the depths of his heart and calmly asked, "Eunuch Yao, what is this for?" Eunuch Yao bowed and respectfully reported, "The Emperor has heard that there are people in the Eastern Palace whose hands are not clean. He is worried about the crown prince and the Empress, so he has sent me here to take these servants to Taichung Temple for interrogation." Naturally, this was a fake excuse. The Empress and Crown Prince met each other's eyes and saw the unease and confusion in the other's eyes. The death of a serving girl could not have caused such a disturbance. The Empress forcefully suppressed the anger in the depths of her heart and gritted her teeth. "The affairs of the palace have never been managed by me. The Emperor worries about the affairs of the country, so why bother him with these small matters?" Eunuch Yao, which servant spoke too much and disturbed the Emperor? Eunuch Yao stood calmly below and did not reply. The Crown Prince sighed and said, "Since it is father's intention, then take them for interrogation." With these words, the eunuchs and serving girls who had already gathered in the Eastern Palace wailed. Although they didn't know what fate awaited them, they knew that Taichung Temple was a place even more terrifying than the Black Prison. "How many people are we taking?" "All of them." Eunuch Yao raised his head and said quietly. The Empress sucked in a cold breath. A moment later, her lips trembled. She said angrily, "Is there no one in the palace to serve?" "Immediately, new people will be sent to serve you too," Eunuch Yao said respectfully. He then waved his hand and ordered the eunuchs and guards to tie up the dozens of eunuchs and serving girls in the Eastern Palace. Along the way, there were people begging for mercy in a low voice. However, the people Eunuch Yao had brought not only tied up people, but also bound their mouth. The Empress knew that there must be a big problem with today's matter. She turned her head and glanced helplessly at the Crown Prince. She wanted to know the truth of the matter from her son's eyes. However, the Crown Prince's face was pale. He had no idea how to respond. Just as Eunuch Yao and his group were preparing to leave the Eastern Palace, the Qing Emperor walked in from outside the palace. He furrowed his brows slightly and said, "What is going on?" Seeing this scene, the Empress quickly led the Crown Prince forward to bow. She said with grief and indignation, "Your Majesty, are you preparing to turn this place into a cold palace?" The Emperor glanced at her with disgust but didn't even glance at the Crown Prince. Directly to Eunuch Yao, he said, "What did I order?" It was a very light sentence. Eunuch Yao knelt to the ground with a thud in fright and repeatedly kowtowed. He then turned his head and viciously said something. The Empress and the Crown Prince stared at this scene dumbstruck. Immediately after, the Empress let out a wretched cry and fainted on the Crown Prince's body. Because, outside the Qing Kingdom's most sacred royal palace, the most benevolent Eastern Palace, the guards raised the knives in their hands and suddenly brought them down. Countless sounds of knives rang out. Dozens of muffled grunts struggled to come out of their gagged mouth. Dozens of heads fell to the ground. Dozens of headless bodies twitched on the ground. Fresh blood suddenly dyed the eastern palace courtyard. The smell of blood wafted into the palace. Chapter 502. The sky gradually brightened. The clouds gradually gathered directly above Jingdo and turned the hazy light into a murky darkness. In the messy group of buildings behind the royal palace, the eunuchs and serving girls who were resting were still tossing and turning in their dreams. However, some of them had already woken up. Hong Zhu forced himself to be alert and slapped himself in the face again and again. He wanted to use this action to keep himself calm. He was not on duty in the Eastern Palace, so he had not been silenced by the eunuchs and guards. Even though he was living in the courtyard of the laundry room, he still felt afraid. He didn't know what he would face next. A sound suddenly came from outside the courtyard. Although it did not wake the people in their dreams, it scared Hong Zhu into rushing to the window. The hand in his sleeve tightly held a poisoned dagger Fan Xian had given him for self-defense. At any moment, he was ready to fight to the death with the people who had come to silence him. If he fought, it would be difficult for him to escape death. However, if he didn't fight and just allowed himself to be captured, young eunuch Hong, who was as stubborn as a scholar, would not do it. His hand was shaking. His ear was pressed against the door, listening to the sounds outside the courtyard. Occasionally, wretched moans and cries rang out. However, those sounds only rang out for a few moments before immediately disappearing. His face was deathly pale. He knew that someone was killing people outside. The eunuchs and serving girls who lived in the laundry room were basically all servants who served the Eastern Palace and Guangxin Palace. Hong Zhu knew what was happening outside for. He gripped the dagger tightly and bit his lip nervously. He didn't even notice that there was a small cut on his lip. He didn't know when those people would come to kill him. He didn't know if he could fight to the death alone. Hong Zhu nervously waited for the arrival of death. After an indeterminable amount of time, there was still no one who came to knock on Hong Zhu's door. Gradually, the noise in the laundry room also disappeared. Outside the courtyard, everything returned to normal. Hong Zhu swallowed a mouthful of fishy saliva and nervously looked out through the crack in the door. He found that there was no one outside. He wanted to push open the door and go out to see what had happened. However, his body had long become stiff from fear. He couldn't move for a moment. He squatted down and rubbed his ankle. Summoning up all his courage, he pushed open the door and walked onto the street of the laundry workshop. Somewhat absent-mindedly, he looked around and found that the doors of the young eunuchs and palace maids' residences were tightly shut. There seemed to be nothing unusual. He walked to a yard and cautiously reached out to push. The door was not bolted and opened with a push. Hong Zhu looked at the courtyard in front of him. The deathly pale color on his face deepened. Even his lips began to glow with a green light. He did not see a yard full of corpses, but he did see a few pools of blood in an inconspicuous corner. The yard was empty, and there was not a single person there. Presumably, it was the same in the other courtyards. The eunuchs and palace maids in these courtyards had all been killed by His Majesty. Even their corpses had been dragged to some secret place and burned under the cover of the darkness before dawn. His Majesty's hands were indeed bloody. Hong Zhu retreated out of the empty courtyard somewhat stupidly and stood in the empty alley of the laundry workshop. He didn't understand why those people hadn't come to kill him. A feeling of having survived a disaster and fear intertwined in his heart, making his entire body tremble. There was a cracking sound. A bright light flashed through the depths of the dark clouds in the sky and disappeared in a flash. The sound of thunder rumbled through Jingdo and the villages around it. Immediately after, a strong wind picked up and countless drops of rain fell to the ground accompanied by the wind and thunder. Hong Zhu stood in the heavy rain and allowed the rain to wash over his face and wet his thin clothes. After a long time, he came back to his senses. Tightly holding the dagger that was like a life-saving straw, he returned to his own courtyard and closed the wooden door tightly, not daring to open it again. Imperial father, why? The crown prince glared angrily at his father with an anger that was rarely seen and roared in a loud voice, "Why?" The Qing emperor did not reply to his words. He only stared at the empress's dazed face. Placing his hands behind his back, he slowly lowered his head and pressed his face against the empress's. The empress's body shook for no reason as she watched the middle-aged man she was most familiar with, loved the most, and hated the most come closer to her. She saw clearly the black-bordered golden dragon robe on his body, saw clearly the golden lines on the dragon robe, and smelled the scent on his body. However, she could not see the expression on the man's face clearly. She could not see the emotions hidden under the expression. Many years had passed, but the empress had never seen the emperor clearly. Her body shook again. It was clear that this empress felt fear toward the emperor from the depths of her bones. The emperor leaned close to her ear and quietly said, "You taught a good son." The empress was startled. She had no idea why such a terrifying thing as purging the palace would happen today. Hearing the emperor say it, only now did she know that it had something to do with the crown prince. However, the crown prince had been very stable and dutiful recently. What trouble could he have caused? Particularly after hearing the emperor's words, an emotion unique to women made the empress excited. In a sharp voice, she yelled, "My son? Is he not your son?" The reply to the empress was a crisp slap. The emperor slowly pulled back his hand and looked at the empress in front of him, who was covering her face and looking at him in disbelief. Coldly, he said, "If you don't want me to depose you, then don't yell here." Even though his words were gentle, they carried a chill that caused one to tremble with fear. A glimmer of hopelessness flashed through the empress's eyes. She looked at the emperor and laughed nervously. "You hit me? You actually hit me? It's been a dozen years, you can't even be bothered to look at me, and now you hit me? Should I thank you?" At this time, the crown prince saw his mother being humiliated and had already charged over with a wild roar. Blocking in front of the empress, he stared angrily and helplessly at the emperor and yelled, "Father, enough!" Although he stood between the emperor and empress, the emperor's deep eyes did not seem to see the crown prince at all. They passed through his body and stared at the sobbing empress behind him. Faintly, he said, "You cannot lose decorum, do you understand, Empress?" The empress fearfully raised her head. Separated by the crown prince's not wide body, she glanced at the emperor. Biting her lip, she didn't speak for a moment. Seeing that she didn't reply, the emperor furrowed his brows slightly and took a step forward. If he took another step forward, he would collide directly into the crown prince's body. The crown prince's heart had already turned completely cold. He knew what kind of harsh and heartless person his father was. A ruler would never be soft-hearted, particularly at this moment. His father had slapped his mother in the face. This at least proved that he still saw his mother as a person. But the emperor's gaze directly passed through him as if he didn't exist. What did this mean? This meant that the emperor no longer saw him as a person. The crown prince didn't understand why his father had become so angry and could not tolerate him. Suddenly, he thought of something. His face became increasingly pale. However, he still stood in front of the empress because he wanted to protect his mother. Although the emperor had only taken one step forward, the crown prince felt as if the peak of Dong Mountain was descending. A threatening aura erupted from the man in the dragon robe in front of him and directly pressed down on his body. The crown prince seemed to be able to hear the creaking of his knees. He was afraid. He wanted to retreat, but he couldn't. He knew that the emperor was in a rage. He didn't know what the emperor would do to his mother in his rage. Thus, he stood unyieldingly between the emperor and empress and used all of his strength to resist the threatening aura. His heart was slightly absent-minded. He wondered if this was the aura that an overlord of a generation possessed. To be able to sit on the dragon chair, did one have to be so iron-blooded and heartless? Why? The crown prince held on with great difficulty under the powerful pressure. The veins on his neck bulged. In a sharp voice he roared, "Father, why?" This time, the emperor finally looked the crown prince squarely in the eye. Looking at the young man who dared to stand in front of him, a faint light rose in his eyes. His voice seemed to be squeezed out from between his lips as he scolded in a low voice, "Disgusting!" The crown prince understood. The crown prince had proven his guess. The crown prince broke down. The crown prince's legs weakened. In an instant, he fell to sit in front of the emperor and began to cry. Tears and snot covered his entire face. The emperor didn't look at him again. He walked to the empress's side and coldly waved his hand. Another slap flew out. The empress gave a wretched cry. She was knocked to the ground by this slap and lay on the low couch. The emperor lowered his head and put it next to the empress's ear. Using a voice that sounded like he was grinding his teeth, he said, "I gave this child to you, and you raised him to this state?" The emperor raised his body and coldly walked out of the eastern palace. Just as he was about to leave, he turned his head back and glanced coldly and with disgust at the crown prince sitting paralyzed on the ground. Disdainfully he said, "If you had dared to stand in front of me earlier, perhaps I would have given you some respect." After saying this unusually cold and emotionless Qing emperor flicked his sleeves and left. His figure appeared tall and straight and stern. He was not like a husband or wife at all. Rather, he was just a ruler. The main doors of the eastern palace were slowly closed. The smell of blood still lingered in the hall. Other than the crying empress and crown prince, there was no one else. It appeared very quiet. The crown prince suddenly slowly stood and woodenly helped his mother into a sitting position. With a slap, the empress slapped him across the face. The crown prince didn't even dodge. His eyes were filled with despair and struggle. He raised his hand and grabbed the wrist his mother had slapped down a second time. Viciously, he said, "Mother, if you don't want to die, then quickly think of a way to inform grandmother." The empress immediately froze. In the eastern palace and Guangxin palace, inside and outside the palace, inside and outside the palace, inside and outside the laundry workshop, in just an hour, any eunuch or serving girl who had once served in the two palaces had been completely killed. Other than Hong Zhu, not a single person was left alive. Hundreds of wronged souls had been sacrificed for the emperor to hide the scandal of the royal family. Perhaps it was only now that the Qing emperor had gradually begun to reveal his most iron-blooded, coldest, and most powerful side. This middle-aged man wearing a dragon robe came alone to Guangxin Palace. There was not a single eunuch by his side. Old eunuch Hong saw that he had come and bowed deeply. He then disappeared without a trace like a ghost. In the entire Guangxin Palace, only the eldest princess inside the palace and the emperor outside were left. The two of them stood separated by the thick palace doors. No one knew what the other was thinking. Would it be death or memories? Would it be a dozen years of knowing each other or a moment of separation? Ruler and official or brother and sister? The wind rose. The dark clouds above Jingdo grew thicker and thicker. A bolt of lightning struck down. Countless drops of rain poured down. Sitting on the low couch, the eldest princess slowly raised her head and looked at the palace doors with a cold and laughable gaze. With a creaking sound, the palace doors were slowly pushed open. A drenched, middle-aged man with long hair flowing down his back slowly walked in. The dragon embroidered on his dragon robe seemed to be struggling in the wet water, wanting to charge out and tear apart everything in the world. The eldest princess, Li Yunrui, looked at him coldly and said, "So, you can also be so wretched." There was a cracking sound. Thunder and lightning exploded in the sky. The lightning illuminated the dark royal palace. In a very short amount of time, it lit up everything incomparably bright. Chapter 503. A bolt of lightning flashed through the dark clouds above Jingdo. A moment later, a muffled clap of thunder rang out, shaking the entire royal palace and making it tremble. Heavy rain poured down, soaking everything in the royal palace. The rain quickly gathered under the palace and flowed down through the gaps between the glazed tiles. The sound was very loud. At this moment it was still spring. Even if there was thunder, it should be dry thunder rumbling. However, this kind of thunderstorm weather inevitably seemed a little abrupt and strange. It was unknown if the heavens were angry or if the Son of Heaven was already angry. The Emperor walked through the main doors of Guangxin Palace. He turned around and slowly closed the palace doors. He then took a hairband from his wrist and carefully tied up his drenched hair. Not a single strand of hair was out of place. It did not match his current mood. The eldest princess leaned against the low couch and looked at him. Suddenly, she began to giggle. At this moment, a bell-like laughter suddenly rang out in the spacious Guangxin Palace. The laughter echoed in the wind and rain. Although it was light and crisp, it could not be concealed. It was transmitted in all directions, making it seem extremely strange. The Emperor's expression did not change. He slowly walked forward and stopped in front of the low couch, in front of the eldest princess. Behind him was a straight line of wet footprints. The distance between each footprint was evenly spaced. The lines formed by the footprints seemed to have been drawn straight. He was not silent for long. The Emperor looked coldly at Li Yunrui and asked, word by word, "Why?" Then, the eldest princess Li Yunrui sank into silence. She furrowed her pretty brows. Her slender fingers gently tapped the low couch beside her. Confusion and innocence flashed through her watery eyes like that of a young girl. She seemed to be thinking, confused, and not knowing what to do. In the end, she raised her head and looked calmly at the most powerful man in the world in front of her. Her red lips opened slightly and her jade teeth parted slightly. Quietly she said, "Why what?" A long time had passed since the Emperor asked that question. The Emperor seemed to be very patient to hear the answer. Without waiting for the Emperor to continue asking, Li Yunrui suddenly sucked in a cold breath. Blinking her large eyes, she used her hand to cover her mouth and said, "You're asking why?" "Why?" She suddenly laughed and stood up. Not showing any weakness, she stood in front of the Emperor and stared at him with a pair of sharp, resentful eyes. Emphasizing each word, she asked, "Brother Emperor, are you asking why your sister is in her 30s and still not married? Or should he ask why his younger sister seduced a scholar when she was only 15 years old? Or do you want to know why you keep so many gigolos?" She gently bit her lip and took a step closer to the Emperor. Staring into his eyes, she asked in a tone that was cold to the bone, "Why? Why did the eldest princess, Li Yunrui, give up glory, splendor, wealth, and a leisurely life to manage the palace treasury for the court for so many years? Why did she, this idiot, forcefully suppress her disgust and help the Qing Emperor recruit talents? Why did she bother to deal with other countries? Why did she secretly organize a Juanshang conference to kill some people the Emperor found inconvenient to kill and to create some conspiracies that would cause the court to lose face? Why? Li Yunrui stared seriously at the Emperor and waved her sleeve. In a sharp voice, she said, "Brother Emperor, why do you think this is? Why was I stupid to such an extent? Why is it that you are the most glorious and beautiful character in the world, yet I am willing to become the darkest character behind you? Why do I have to bear this reputation?" The Emperor was silent and cold, looking at her pitifully. The eldest princess suddenly laughed crazily. "Isn't this all for you? My dearest brother, if you want to leave your name in the annals of history, then those dirty things must be borne by someone else. But, have you ever thought about me? Me?" The eldest princess angrily grabbed the Emperor's dragon robe and hatefully said, "I also want to ask you why. Why do you have to take away everything that belongs to me? Why don't you have any affection? Look at that illegitimate child of yours. You took everything from me and gave it to him. Why? I know that everything will be gone. I am willing, as long as you are willing. But it cannot be him. Why did it have to be him? Li Yunrui panted and then quickly calmed down. Using a pitiful gaze, she glanced at the emperor and slowly said, "It's a pity that your illegitimate child is still only willing to have the surname Fan." The emperor looked at her silently. A moment later, he slowly said, "You're crazy." "I'm not crazy!" Li Yunrui screamed angrily. "I was crazy for the past dozen years. But I'm not crazy today." "You're crazy," the emperor coldly said. The emperor coldly said, "You've asked so many whys. It seems like the root of all this is me. Have you ever thought that your love for power has reached an abnormal level?" "Strange." Li Yunrui furrowed her brows. A disdainful expression flashed across her face. "If a woman wants power, then it is strange. Then, what do you, the person with the most power in the world, count for? How dare you?" The emperor squeezed out a low voice from his throat and waved his hand to strike. The eldest princess raised her face and looked at him coldly. She looked at his hand and did not care at all. "Everything you have was given to you by me." The emperor slowly lowered his hand and coldly said, "I can easily take it all back. Everything I have was obtained through my own hard work." The eldest princess looked at him coldly. "If you want to take everything back, you will have to kill me." Another peal of thunder rang out outside the palace. The wind and rain seemed to have picked up. The emperor looked at his sister and suddenly laughed. There was an icy coldness in his laughter. "Perhaps you think I can't bear to kill you? Of course you can bear to." A glimmer of mockery suddenly flashed through the eldest princess Li Yunrui's eyes. "Is there anyone in this world that you can't bear to kill?" The emperor, who had been calm the entire time, was suddenly stabbed in the depths of his heart by this gaze. Li Yunrui looked into his eyes coldly and said, "Brother Emperor, wake up. Don't always pretend to be the most loyal person in the world. Presumably, you've already been to the Eastern Palace and showed that you've lost your composure. It seems that you've been hurt in the depths of your heart. But who are you fooling? Don't lie to yourself. You've always been waiting to get rid of me. In the depths of your heart, you feel that you owe me, so you need to find a reason to convince yourself." She harshly said, "Yes, you just need to convince yourself. Make you feel that personally killing your own sister, the sister who has been by your side since childhood and who has given up countless years for you after growing up, is not your problem. It is just that I deserve to die." When she said the word, "deserve to die," Li Yunrui's voice became sharp. When the emperor heard the words, "Eastern Palace," he had already closed his eyes. A moment later, he slowly said, "In the end, you are my own sister and the person Mother loves the most. If it hadn't come to this, no matter what, I would have protected you with riches and honor. You disrupted court discipline, buried private soldiers, used the Ming family, and organized the Juanshang Conference. Which one of these is not a great crime of deceiving the emperor? However, what do these things count for? You are, after all, my own sister, the sister I have loved since childhood. If I don't offend you, then you are not guilty. In these years, regardless of whether you sold out Yan Bingyun or wanted to assassinate Fan Xian, I don't blame you because I don't think these things are that big of a deal." He opened his eyes. His gaze had already calmed down. "But you shouldn't have interfered with your nephews. The second prince has already been led astray by you, although he has hidden it well on the surface." Li Yunrui smiled coldly and interrupted, "Your own son was driven crazy by you. What about Chengqian?" The emperor stared fiercely into Li Yunrui's eyes. "Do you know that he is the crown prince? He is the next emperor that I have carefully nurtured. I am going to conquer a large kingdom and want this child to guard it for me for 10,000 years. If you assisted him, I would only be happy, but you bewitched him." Another muffled clap of thunder rang out on the horizon. The sound was not very loud, but it shook Guangxin Palace to ringing. Amidst the might of heaven and earth, the Emperor's angry voice remained sharp and pierced into the eldest princess' ears. The lightning seeped in through the window and lit up Guangxin Palace for an instant. In that instant, the Emperor stretched out his steady right hand and gripped the eldest princess' throat tightly. He pushed her forward, stepping over the low couch and the screen, and firmly pressed the most beautiful woman in Qin Kingdom against the palace wall. The veins between his fingers bulged as he exerted force. It was difficult for the eldest princess to breathe, but she did not cry for help or beg for pity. She only looked coldly and pitifully at the angry middle-aged man in front of her. Her pure, swan-like neck was gripped by that hand. The flow of blood was not smooth. It made her face turn red and instead gave off a strange and moving sense of beauty. I have never thought of changing the heir. Everything is for Qingqian's future because my kingdom needs a benevolent and powerful ruler to inherit it. All of this has been destroyed by you. The Emperor roared angrily. Why? A glimmer of confusion flashed through the eyes of the eldest princess, whose face was completely red. Shortly after, it was a look of understanding. She smiled slightly and panted as she said, "So, all of this was an act. So, Fan Xian was also being played by you. Presumably, in the future, his death will be even worse than mine." Her body was gripped against the palace wall. The tips of her feet barely touched the ground. She looked very wretched. It was at this moment that she smiled with difficulty. "However, you definitely won't let Qingqian inherit the throne. Are you prepared to let Fan Xian be the emperor?" "No, brother emperor, I know you. Even if you die, you won't let Fan Xian take the lead." Hearing these words, the emperor's hand slowed a little. The eldest princess gazed at him with amusement and ridicule. She panted as she said, "Brother emperor, you are too suspicious. You are too good at pretending. You wanted to train the crown prince, but you scared the crown prince like a mouse. He thinks that you can remove him at any moment. How can he not be afraid? How can he not need a reliable embrace like mine?" Embrace. The eldest princess Li Yunrui did not seem to be afraid of death at all. She continued to stimulate the emperor's eardrums. The emperor stared at her and only asked, "Why? Why?" Li Yunrui suddenly began to struggle under his hand. In the end, it only increased her pain. In a sharp and angry voice, she cried out, "Why? There is no why. He likes me. That is the reason. I like to play with him, to play until you feel pain and despair." She giggled nervously. "I only found out today that your despair and pain are greater than I imagined. I am very satisfied." The emperor looked at her woodenly and slowly said, "He likes you? Can't I?" The eldest princess' beautiful face was completely red. It appeared particularly seductive under the occasional flash of lightning. She panted and proudly said, "Is there a man in this world who doesn't like me?" She looked at the emperor's face close to hers and suddenly froze. In a daze, she raised her powerless right hand and touched the emperor's face. In a tone filled with infatuation, she said, "Brother emperor, you also like me. Shameless." The emperor slapped her hand away. Li Yunrui did not get angry. She only panted and said firmly, "You like me. However, I am your sister. But, so what? Liking is liking. Even if you hide your thoughts at the foot of Dong Mountain or in the ocean, you will still find them. You can't throw away your thoughts. Not all men are as emotional as wild beasts." The emperor looked coldly at his sister, whose breathing was becoming more and more rushed. "Not all men will bow down to your skirt. Women never think that they will stand above men. You're talking about Yi Qingmei, right?" Li Yunrui suddenly spat at him viciously. "I am not her. You will never be as good as her." The emperor suddenly moved closer to her ear and said, "Even if you struggle for so many years, you will never be as good as her. You will never be able to reach her place in my heart. You know this yourself." A deathly gray color suddenly flashed across Li Yunrui's face. It was as if these words had struck her deepest weakness. A glimmer of cruelty flashed through the Emperor's eyes. He continued to speak by her ear. You can only forever chase after her footsteps, but you will never catch up. Now, she and my son are going to take everything from you. Are you in pain? Li Yunrui struggled to her feet and stared at him with a fierce and hateful gaze. You're not even as good as my illegitimate son. Thunder rumbled outside the window. The Emperor's soft words fell into the eldest princess's ears, but in the eldest princess's ears, they were even more frightening than the thunder outside the window. You said earlier that you can play with all men. Why don't you play with him? Li Yunrui's gaze gradually calmed. With great difficulty, she said calmly, he is Wan Er's husband. The Emperor looked at her with a mocking and malicious gaze. You even dare to act against your own nephew. Do you still know such a thing as honor? The eldest princess gazed at him pitifully without showing any weakness. There are 3 of us siblings, but there are 2 of us crazy. I don't know. Do you know? If you really knew, you wouldn't have taken your subordinate's sweetheart into the palace as a concubine. The sound of wind and thunder outside the palace suddenly stopped. A deathly silence filled the air. The Emperor's hand was firm and unmoving. Clutching the eldest princess's weak throat, he didn't speak for a moment. During the northern expedition, you were heavily injured. Your entire body was stiff and unable to move. The eldest princess coughed and viciously said, It was Chen Pingping who suddenly attacked from thousands of li and risked great danger to save you from the mountains in the north. It was the Dongi female slave, Lady Ning, who served you, a wooden person, along the way. The journey was so difficult. Director Chen could only drink horse urine and eat horse meat. But for these 2 benefactors, what did you do? You clearly knew that Chen Pingping liked Lady Ning, and that Lady Ning admired Chen Pingping. As the master, you stabbed a knife in and took Lady Ning. Brother Emperor, don't think that just because I was young at the time, I don't know about this. Why was Mother so angry? Was it just because of Lady Ning's identity? Why did she have to be executed? If Yi Qingmei had not interceded, Lady Ning and the great prince would have long ceased to exist. Do you know such a thing as honor? Don't say nonsense like Chen Pingping is a eunuch, the eldest princess said viciously. Do you think you are cleaner than me? What disappointed Li Yunrui was that the Emperor did not seem to be shocked or uneasy. He only looked at her coldly. The Emperor slowly increased the strength of his hand and said, word by word, Before you die, you still did not forget to drive a wedge between me and Director Chen. Yunrui, I truly admire you, so I cannot keep you alive. In the Eastern Palace, the pitiful mother and son were still terrified and uneasy. The pale-faced crown prince was much better off than the empress. Although he knew that he was about to face a terrifying end, he was, after all, the son of the Qing emperor. He had always been raised as the next emperor. The terrifying calmness in his blood came into effect at this moment. If he wanted to save himself, he had to first save the eldest princess. The crown prince knew that there was only one person in this palace who could save someone from his angry father's knife. Furthermore, the emperor would not tell that person the truth. The emperor, who was filial to his mother, would not let the scandal of the royal family harm his elderly body. Thus, the crown prince knew that he still had a chance of survival. However, the Eastern Palace had long been surrounded by the people eunuch Yao had brought. It was impossible to make contact with people outside the palace. Even the trusted aides the empress and the crown prince cultivated in the other palaces were unable to get close in the thunderstorm. Chapter 504. The heavy rain was still beating against the buildings in the royal palace and the hearts of the people in the palace. Guangxin Palace was completely silent. Perhaps it was silence, at least. The malicious words of the brother and sister inside were covered by the sound of the rain and thunder. None of it reached outside the palace. Even so, there was still no one outside Guangxin Palace. Even old eunuch Hong was not there. Everyone kept their distance. As long as they kept their distance from Guangxin Palace, it was the same as keeping their distance from death. Eunuch Yao was still outside the Eastern Palace, but his thoughts had long turned to Guangxin Palace. His hands and feet were cold, and his heart was cold. He didn't know what was happening in the palace. Although he knew he shouldn't think about that scene, he still couldn't help it. He wiped away the rain on his face and carefully watched the movements in the Eastern Palace. Since the Emperor had left this palace for him to watch, then he could not allow the Empress and Crown Prince inside to make any noise. Compared to Guangxin Palace, the situation in the Eastern Palace seemed to be much calmer. Although Eunuch Yao was nervous, he was not afraid. All of the servants in the Eastern Palace had been beheaded. Only the orphan and widow were left inside. No matter what, they wouldn't be able to make any noise. However, his eyes, which were wet from the rain, suddenly became dry and burning. Such a great fire! The majestic flames rose from the beautiful palaces of the Eastern Palace and turned into countless fiery red sprites. They reached toward the rain-spattered sky. Incomparable heat accompanied the flames and quickly spread in all directions. Eunuch Yao's pupils suddenly constricted, but the red in his eyes did not fade at all. The Eastern Palace was on fire. At this time, other than the noble mother and son in the palace lighting the fire themselves, no one could do it. But did this pair of mother and son want to burn themselves? Furthermore, the rain was falling so heavily. How did the fire start? Why was the sky full of rain unable to extinguish the fire? Eunuch Yao knew that this was not the time to investigate how the fire had started. He had to immediately make a decision on whether to put out the fire or what. Should he allow the Empress and Crown Prince to burn themselves to death? Eunuch Yao did not spend a long time to think. He knew that no matter how angry the Emperor was, if the Empress and the Crown Prince died without enduring the Emperor's anger under his watch, the Emperor's anger would fall on his head. A moment later, Eunuch Yao's throat seemed to have been scorched by fire. He yelled hoarsely and sharply, "There's a fire!" There were countless large copper vats that stored water in the royal palace and countless eunuchs and serving girls. When the Eastern Palace caught fire, there were already people who reacted and rushed over, desperately trying to put out the fire. Eunuch Yao was nervous and careful and did not participate. He stood on the periphery and watched the busy crowd with a dark expression. He was extremely careful and did not let anyone first come into contact with the mother and son in the burning palace. This fire was a little strange. It didn't seem like the palace had ignited by itself. Instead, someone had used some highly flammable oil, so the fire was so fierce that even the rain couldn't extinguish it. However, when these materials burned out, the flame didn't have the power to continue, so it died out very quickly. There were loyal eunuchs and servants who broke through the blackened palace doors and wanted to charge in to save their masters inside. However, once the little eunuch broke through the palace doors, he found his vision darkened. For some reason, he had been hit in the head by a wooden pillar and fainted. Eunuch Yao coldly walked in first. The guards and eunuchs behind him once again surrounded the Eastern Palace, blocking the people fighting the fire outside the palace. The Eastern Palace had already been burned to a wretched state. On the stone floor in front of the palace, the Empress was being held in the arms of the Crown Prince. Other than a few burn marks on her body, she was in a sorry state after being soaked by the rain. Eunuch Yao bowed slightly. "The fire has been extinguished." His meaning was very simple. Since the fire had been extinguished, the two masters had to temporarily stay in the palace. The Crown Prince, who had a string of blisters on his palm, stared into Eunuch Yao's eyes. A ruthless expression flashed through his face. He said each word clearly, "Unless you kill me now, the entire royal palace will know of the fire in the Eastern Palace. How long do you think you can hide it?" Then, the Crown Prince raised his voice and calmly said, "I am fine. It's just that mother has fainted from the smoke. His voice easily traveled outside the eastern palace and fell into the ears of the people who had come to put out the fire. It made their hearts relax. As long as the Empress and Crown Prince were fine, they wouldn't have to be unlucky. However, when this voice fell into the ears of the eunuchs and guards surrounding the eastern palace, it represented another meaning. Eunuch Yao's body shook and he slowly raised his head. Looking at the normally ordinary Crown Prince in front of him, he furrowed his brows slightly. Only now did he realize that this Crown Prince was, after all, the Emperor's own son. At the moment of impending disaster, this kind of decisiveness and self-immolation was used beautifully. The Emperor had to take care of family matters and maintain his face, so he had chosen the darkest hours before dawn. Heaven had played along and sent down a thunderstorm to liven things up. Hundreds of servants had already died in the royal palace. It was to cover up the people's torrent of mouth. However, there was a fire in the eastern palace. Everyone knew that the Crown Prince and Empress were safe and sound. This matter could no longer be kept quiet. The so-called family matters were gradually turning into national matters. Eunuch Yao looked at the calm Crown Prince. Suddenly, his heart jumped. He found that this usually good-for-nothing Crown Prince, regardless of whether it was his brows or expression, was very much like the Emperor when something happened. The woman with the most power in the Qin kingdom, that old woman, had actually woken up an hour ago. Old people needed very little time to sleep, but the Empress Dowager still habitually lay on the large soft couch in Hanguang Palace with her eyes closed to rest. For some reason, she had been awake for so long, but the sky was still so dark. It made her not interested in getting up and walking around the garden. In particular, the wind, rain, and thunder later made the Empress Dowager furrow her brows and close her eyes even tighter. She was not afraid of thunder, but she hated the sound of it. She always felt that heaven had something against the Li family and was using this method to tell her. After the wind and thunder, a faint clamor came from the distance. However, this noise quickly disappeared. The dark palace recovered its peace. The Empress Dowager did not want to lie down anymore. With the help of the nannies and serving girls, she slowly rose from the bed and shakily put on her clothes. She carefully ironed a green sash around her forehead and was helped to sit on a chair. The serving girls silently carried a golden basin to help the old woman wash up. The warm water in the basin gave off steam. The Empress Dowager stared at the steam in the basin in a daze. After a moment, she sighed and waved her hand. Where was the ruckus just now? The serving girls and nannies looked at each other. Although they had heard it and vaguely guessed it was from the Eastern Palace, it was still early in the morning. No one had come out of the palace. No one knew what had happened. Even if someone guessed something had happened in the Eastern Palace, no one dared to voice their guess in front of the Empress Dowager. At this moment, the palace maid holding the copper basin opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something. An old eunuch slowly walked in from outside the palace. In the entire royal palace, other than the emperor, only this old eunuch could enter the Empress Dowager's palace without being announced. When the serving girls and nannies around the Empress Dowager saw the old eunuch enter, they became even more silent. Only a glimmer of despair and struggle flashed across the serving girl's face. Eunuch Hong slowly walked to the Empress Dowager's side and said, "A few days ago, the Eastern Palace caught a few servants with dirty hands and feet. In the end, they didn't kill them all and made a ruckus. I had Xiao Yao go. It was a small matter." The Empress Dowager furrowed her brows slightly and made an "oh" sound. Her gaze glanced at the serving girl carrying the basin. Old Eunuch Hong also glanced at the palace maid with his cloudy eyes. The serving girl's body trembled, and she slowly lowered her head. However, she immediately raised her head and said quickly, "Eastern Palace." After saying these two words, she paused and stared in terror in front of her. The Empress Dowager used her old and trembling hand to firmly hold Eunuch Hong's wrist because she knew that as long as Eunuch Hong was willing, this old dog had countless ways to make that palace made unable to say a single word. "There's a fire," the serving girl carrying the basin said in a trembling voice, "such a big fire. The Empress and the Crown Prince are still inside." Eunuch Hong slowly shook his head and pulled his hand back into his sleeve. The Empress Dowager stared closely at the serving girl and asked, "Where is the Emperor?" "The Emperor is in Guangxin Palace." The palace maid bit her lip and passed on her master's last words, which were also her last words in this world. She took out a hairpin from her sleeve with her left hand and pierced the tip of the hairpin into her throat, causing blood to gush out. The basin in her hand fell to the ground with a crash. Her body also fell to the ground with a muffled thud. Hanguang Palace was deathly silent. All of the serving girls and housemaids were stunned by this scene. No one could speak. Death is not worth pitying. The Empress Dowager stood up and didn't even glance at the serving girl's body on the ground. She said, "To Guangxin Palace." The rain outside Guangxin Palace gradually lessened. The eldest princess's breathing also slowed. The red on her face had turned from pink to a deep red that was close to death. Her large and alluring eyes gradually protruded. It was very strange. Her body was suspended from the beautiful palace wall, and her life hung in the great hand which clasped her beautiful white neck. Perhaps death was about to arrive, but this woman, the strangest woman in the Qin kingdom in 20 years, was, in the end, crazy. Thus, there was not a glimmer of fear toward death in her eyes. There was only a faint hint of mockery and ridicule. The target of the mockery and ridicule was, naturally, the most powerful person in the world in front of her, her brother, the Emperor of the Qin kingdom. Perhaps it was because of this hint of mockery, the Qing Emperor's hand loosened slightly, giving Li Yunrui a chance to catch her breath. Li Yunrui breathed deeply. Suddenly, she raised her fist and punched the Emperor's sturdy body with all her might. Because she was breathing too quickly, even her snot and saliva flowed out and dripped onto her still beautiful but slightly deformed face. Perhaps death was not scary, but no one would suddenly grab a chance to live when they were about to die and not lose their will. The Emperor looked at her coldly and mockingly. Enunciating each word, he said, "So, in the end, crazy people are still afraid of death." The eldest princess spat on the Emperor's face and laughed crazily in a raspy voice. The Emperor slowly wiped away the spit on his face. His expression did not change. He then raised his hand and slowly wiped away the thing on the eldest princess' face. Slowly, he said, "You and I, brother and sister, seem to have not had many intimate words these years. What harm is there in giving you a bit more time?" "There's no need for time." The eldest princess chuckled with difficulty and said, "I was just thinking, if you kill me today, will you kill Chen Pingping next? It's very strange that you didn't bring a single tiger guard with you for such a big event like purging the palace. Who are you guarding against?" "Against?" Given the situation in the Qin court, once the balance was completely broken, as the Emperor, he had to establish a new balance. The old generation would become sacrifices. Very good. Looks like Fan Jian is dead, and Fan Xian is also going to die. With so many people accompanying me, what do I care? The eldest princess suddenly spat at the Emperor's face again and said in a raspy voice, "You are alone. You are alone. Kill me. Kill me. You have no son. You have nothing. You are just a lonely ghost." "The Emperor does not need friends," the Emperor said coldly. "As for my sons, if they dare to rebel, I can have more." Outside Guangxin Palace, a hurried knocking suddenly came from the door. The sound was very loud. It seemed that the person outside was in a hurry. Chapter 505. The Emperor slowly closed his eyes and said, "You overestimated my patience. I underestimated your power in the palace." The eldest princess gazed at the Emperor and panted. I know you have always been giving me chances. In reality, I have also been giving you chances. As long as you don't want to kill me, I simply cannot summon the courage to harm you. In this life, I am already used to being behind you. It is not an easy matter to completely stand in front of you. I don't want to harm you, so I have never acted. Yet, you have made me despair. Li Yunrui panted. Shortly after, she smiled gently and said, So, kill me. If I am alive, I will do everything in my power to kill you. No one can kill me, the Emperor said calmly. Then, his hand slowly tightened. At this time, the knocking outside Guangxin Palace strangely stopped. A strange light flashed through the eldest princess' eyes. You are my sister. The Emperor suddenly extended his hand and gently stroked her cheek. He muttered, Even if you are not well behaved, you are still my sister. This was the last conversation the Emperor and the eldest princess had in this world. Then, the door of Guangxin Palace was cut open by a few blades of light that were as white as snow. After a crisp hiss, the palace door collapsed with a bang. The Empress Dowager walked into Guangxin Palace, accompanied by old eunuch Hong and surrounded by several tiger guards. Her face was calm, but her eyes were unusually panicked. Son! The Empress Dowager looked at the shocking scene in front of her and screamed. The eldest princess glanced at the Emperor close to her with a slightly dazed gaze. She found that after the Emperor heard this scream, a self-mocking smile rose to the corners of his lips. She didn't know who this smile was mocking. One finger, gradually loosened from the eldest princess' red neck. It was like a poisonous vine on a tree branch gradually losing its strength. The Emperor closed his eyes and used a long time to calm his breathing. He then slowly pulled back his hand and turned his body. Slightly tidying up his dragon robe that had been messed up by the eldest princess, he expressionlessly welcomed his mother. Holding her hand, he quietly said, Mother, let's go back. The Empress Dowager's gaze stopped on the eldest princess, who had collapsed against the palace wall and was caressing her burning red neck. She was trembling all over. The Emperor tightened his grip on the Empress Dowager's hand and gently said, Mother, let's go. Although his words were gentle, and although he expressed a compromise, it was also filled with an irresistible majesty. The Empress Dowager's hand trembled again as she said in a trembling voice, Go back to the palace quickly. The Emperor suddenly stopped his steps at the door of Guangxin Palace. The expression on his face was as calm as ever, but his brows furrowed slightly. He said, I believe that all the people in this world are my people. The expressions of the tiger guards who had broken into the palace earlier froze. With a few gusts of wind, the tiger guards following the Empress Dowager let out a few miserable groans and fell into a pool of blood. The Emperor respectfully held the Empress Dowager's hand as they left Guangxin Palace. Old eunuch Hong followed behind him with his hands in his sleeves. The palace gates of Guangxin Palace closed once again, shutting off the eldest princess's panting sounds inside. The court conference had been delayed by an hour. The opening time of the 13 city gates of Jingdo had also been delayed by an hour. This hour was enough for many things to happen in the royal palace. It was also enough for the civil and military officials in court to have a general idea of what the emperor had done. Thus, no one dared to actually go to the royal palace after an hour. All of the officials attending court followed their original time and waited obediently outside the royal palace's city gate. However, the atmosphere today was very strange. No one gathered together to discuss or chat. Even exchanging pleasantries seemed to have become a crime. The abnormal silence made everyone feel a sense of pressure. Before dawn, most of the eldest princess's power in court and in Jingdo had been swept clean. Some of these powers were not even known to the officials in the past. The operation this time had come so quickly, acted so decisively and ruthlessly, and pulled the net so cleanly and efficiently. It made these officials feel a glimmer of coldness. It was said that the person in command in Jingdo was that old dog of the Overwatch Council. The officials knew how high the level of this matter was. Standing in front of the royal palace and analyzing their own thoughts, they understood that this world was, in the end, the emperor's world, not the prince's world, much less the eldest princess's plaything. As long as the emperor wanted to make a move one day, he could easily sweep these people clean. It was only at this moment that the officials recovered their usual reverence for the man sitting high on the dragon throne. Only then did they remember that they seemed to have gotten used to His Majesty's silence over the years and had forgotten his supreme glory and great achievements in the past. However, the officials could not just silently accept it because they didn't know what would happen in the court conference next. If the emperor wanted to use this matter to carry out another large purge of the court, the elders of the Hall of Governmental Affairs were worried that the Qing Kingdom's bureaucracy would not be able to withstand such a storm. Commissioner Fan had already arrested too many officials. If he arrested another group, who would work for the court? Even more people were guessing how Her Highness the eldest princess had offended His Majesty and ended up in such a state. No matter what, these officials could not guess the true cause of the incident. Naturally, they could not associate it with the bloody and gloomy scenes in the imperial palace. There was no news coming from the royal palace. It seemed very calm. The whips rang out. The officials lined up in order. Among them were the scholars Shu and Hu, who were at the very front of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, as well as the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian. However, there were a number of people missing from the ranks below the dragon chair. These people were probably in the Supreme Court or the Overwatch Council. The officials entered with their heads lowered. After a moment of silence, they were shocked to find that there was no one on the dragon chair. Shu Wu glanced at Hu the scholar worriedly. Although he didn't say anything, his gaze had already conveyed enough information. This old scholar had served the emperor for many years. He knew the emperor's will and methods. Since he had said to delay by an hour, then the emperor must have the confidence to finish everything within an hour. Given the emperor's bearing, he would not do or say anything he was not confident in. However, an hour had passed and he still had not come to court. Could it be that the matters in the palace had become so troublesome? The rain in Jingdo had long stopped. The red clouds of dawn floated on the horizon. Although it was not hot, it was enough to make those who saw it feel a glimmer of warmth. However, the Qing officials in Taiji Palace felt cold, nervous, and uneasy in their hearts. Following a eunuch salute, the man wearing the dragon robe finally arrived late. After the loud cries of "Long live the Emperor!" he spoke in order, handed over memorials, and passed them down for approval. All of the procedures of the court meeting appeared smooth and natural. On such a morning, no one dared to make the emperor the slightest bit angry. Shu Wu raised his head and stole a glance. He found the emperor sitting on the dragon chair with a calm expression. There was only a slight hint of exhaustion. Someone had to do anything that provoked bad luck. After all, the rules of the court were there, and the civil officials had their duties. 2 ministers had suddenly been arrested and thrown into prison, 3 out of 10 imperial censorates of the imperial censorate were gone, and 2 large bloody cases had suddenly appeared in Jingdo. For such a major matter, it was impossible to avoid it even if one pretended to be deaf and mute. Shu Wu sighed. After quietly apologizing to himself in his heart, he stepped out of the ranks and slowly spoke of what had happened last night. He then respectfully asked for the emperor's edict. The emperor propped his chin on the chair. After a long silence, he slowly said, "The matters of the Overwatch Council are all under my orders. These people are all in prison." Normally, Shu Wu dared to directly clash with the emperor and sternly admonish him. He knew that this was only because the emperor needed a somewhat comical and frank official like him. However, today's matter was very important. No matter what, he could not rashly ask. He swallowed and moistened his somewhat dry throat from nervousness. Respectfully, he asked, "I do not know what Minister Yen and the others have done. The emperor glanced at him, closed his eyes, and waved his hand. Eunuch Yao had already taken out a number of memorials and files from the yellow silk box beside the dragon chair. He jogged down the royal platform and distributed them to the old officials standing at the very front. Of course, old people like Xu Wu and Fan Jian knew what was written in the memorials and files. They had long guessed it, but when they read it themselves, they still had to show an expression of shock, anger, and guilt. The files were, of course, the results of the Overwatch Council's investigation. The crimes of the officials who had been thrown into prison last night were all as clear as could be. The confessions were all there, and the witnesses and material evidence had already been sent to the Supreme Court. It was completely against those officials. It was impossible to give them any chance to turn things around. The three expressions these officials put on in court were to show the emperor that they knew nothing about the crimes of Minister of Appointments Yan Hangshu and the others, which was why they were shocked. As colleagues in court, they were incomparably angry at these sinful officials who took the emperor's salary but deceived the emperor and bullied the people. As for guilt, it was because they had been in court for many years, yet they had not discovered these sinful officials' wild ambitions ahead of time. They had not told the emperor ahead of time and exposed these people's ugly faces. They could not escape the crime of not knowing people well. They had worked hard for the emperor's sacred judgment. They could not help but feel ashamed to the emperor, the court, and the people of Qin Kingdom. These three expressions were done very well, but the emperor's expression remained indifferent. A self-mocking and mocking smile appeared at the corners of his lips. The reason he had come to court an hour late was because he had to comfort his mother in Hanguang Palace and take care of everything in the royal palace. It was clear that he had not explained to the Empress Dowager the reason for his anger. Strangely, the emperor was not very disappointed that he had not been able to secretly erase the eldest princess. Other than the three expressions among the officials, there was one more expression. It was one of fear and terror. The dossier had been circulated around the court, and there were already 4 officials kneeling on the ground. These officials were all people who had some relationship with the eldest princess in the past, and they couldn't escape from the matter mentioned in the dossier. As soon as they saw the dossier, they knew that their doomsday had arrived. These 4 officials knelt in Taiji Palace and kowtowed with all their might, but they did not cry out for the emperor to spare them. They knew that the emperor hated those who shamelessly begged for mercy the most. The emperor glanced coldly at the 4 officials and said, "The crime does not reach the masses." The 4 officials' bodies shook. It was as if they had not thought the emperor would so easily spare them. The joy after the shock made one of them unable to resist sitting paralyzed on the ground and unable to speak for a moment. The emperor furrowed his brows and glanced at that person but didn't say anything. After the court conference, all that was left in the royal study was the true center of power in the Qin Kingdom. The Hall of Governmental Affairs, as well as the heads of the 6 ministries and 3 temples, still sat on embroidered stools as usual. However, these important figures seemed to feel like they were sitting on the tip of a needle and were very uncomfortable. There were no crown princes listening. The officials were guessing in their hearts, but they did not show anything on their faces. The emperor glanced at these people and slowly said, "There are some things that I can say in court, but there are some things that I can only say here because you are all pillars of the Qin Kingdom. The emperor's family matters are also part of the affairs of the country. You must know." Everyone's heart tightened. They knew that this was going to talk about the eldest princess matter. They quickly bowed forward. "Yan Hangshu and the others are only claws and teeth. I will not kill them lightly." The emperor leaned against the low couch and said, "I will not make any major movements in court. Never mind, you can read first." At this moment, the files in the hands of the ministers were not the ones that were circulated in the imperial court. Instead, they were true secrets, so the ministers did not need to disguise the 3 expressions, because these 3 expressions came from the depths of their hearts. The eldest princess, Li Yunrui, betrayed the head spy of the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council stationed in northern Qi, Yan Bingyun, colluded with the Ming family, secretly formed pirates, and stole goods from the palace treasury. Secretly ordered the Jiaozhou navy to massacre the island. Ordered assassins to assassinate court officials in the streets. Shu the scholar's fingers holding the files were trembling. Although these officials knew that the eldest princess was powerful and ambitious, they had not expected it to be to such an extent. In particular, these 4 crimes were too frightening. When the Qing Kingdom and Northern Qi were negotiating, the Northern Qi people had suddenly thrown out a bargaining chip that caught the Qing Kingdom unprepared and shook the court. The capture of the head spy of Northern Qi had been single-handedly orchestrated by the eldest princess. The shock of that matter was too great. Many officials still remembered it vividly, particularly after a snowstorm of words floated through Jingdou. Each word on the paper pointed directly at the eldest princess and forced her to leave the capital helplessly. Yan Bingyun was now the head of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. This was something all the officials in the royal study knew. The officials had thought it was just a verbal attack. Unexpectedly, it was true. This. Shu Wu's heart was filled with anger, but he couldn't say anything. The investigation in the files was too detailed and clear. Even if these officials didn't believe it, it was still difficult, particularly since the witnesses of the last 3 crimes were still locked up in prison. There is a little thing called the Juanshan Conference, the emperor said with his eyes closed. It was something Yunrui made. Although the account's master ran, in the end, the Black Knights still captured a number of people. As for the assassination in the streets, those 2 assassins are still in prison. Hu the scholar was slightly more composed. Although he didn't know why the emperor wanted to bring the matter of the royal family to the table, he still asked sincerely, could there have been a mistake? After all, it was all the results of the Overwatch Council's investigation. These words were spoken very clearly. Everyone understood. If these great crimes were truly pointed at the eldest princess, there would be no possibility for the eldest princess to rise again in the Qing Kingdom. However, everyone knew that ever since Fan Xian took control of the Overwatch Council, he had fought to the death with the eldest princess, openly and secretly, in Jingdou and Jiangnan. If the eldest princess lost power, then Fan Xian's faction would become the one with the most weight in court. Thus, Hu the scholar reminded the emperor. The emperor slowly said, the matter was indeed all investigated by Fan Xian, but this young man would not use such petty tricks as framing someone. The assassin's confessions and the Jiaozhou Navy general's signatures are all there. The account books are also there. The Ming family's confessions have all come out. There is no need to be suspicious. Hu the scholar saw that the emperor did not listen to his secret advice. He knew that the emperor must have other plans in his heart, so he returned to silence. Fortunately, Yan Bingyun did not die. The emperor suddenly opened his eyes and coldly said, otherwise, how could I face the people of the Qing Kingdom? Regardless of whether it is the soldiers in the army or the secret agents of the Overwatch Council, they are all good men who have risked their lives for the Qing Kingdom. Yet, they were all sold out by the nobility for their own selfishness. Sold out. His voice rose and he said with disgust, disgusting. There was silence in the royal study. After a long time, the emperor tiredly said, but, after all, Yunrui is my sister. If you all have any resentment, feel free to explode at me. After these words were said, all of the officials in the royal study knelt in unison on the ground and repeatedly said they did not dare. They all felt it was very strange. What kind of status did the eldest princess have? Who would dare to force the emperor to use Qing law to sentence her to death? However, wouldn't it be better for these things to be handled in the palace? Why did the emperor have to tell them so openly, explode? God, where did the emperor get these words from? To prevent the people from discussing, the eldest Princess Li Yunrui's title and fiefdom will not be removed, the emperor suddenly said. Ren Xiaoan. The official of Taichung Temple, Ren Xiaoan, who was kneeling at the back, quickly moved a few steps forward. His legs were shaking, and his heart was beating like a drum. Originally, the royal study meeting had nothing to do with him. Earlier, he had been suspicious and afraid. Only now did he understand that the emperor wanted him to accept the edict. Taichung Temple managed the daily lives of the members of the royal family and all palace etiquette. I am here. The eldest princess has occasionally caught a cold. She has entered the side courtyard of the royal family in the west of the city to rest. Unless there is an edict, no one is to disturb her. She will be watched by the Overwatch Council. The emperor paused and then slowly closed his eyes. Tiredly, he said, when the great river's dikes have been completely repaired, that is when she can come out. Chapter 506. My apologies, I will write less these days. I am truly sorry. There is something wrong with my mental state, and I keep feeling my heart palpitate. I don't know why. It should be a mental problem, not a physical problem. I wish everyone a happy weekend. There was a fire in the imperial palace. Although it was raining heavily that day, and the fire came out of nowhere, intentionally or unintentionally, the crown prince's tutors and others all saw the crown prince, who had been frightened and was not very willing to speak. Thus, in the following days, the crown prince did not listen in at the side of the royal study. There was a good reason. Not many people would suspect that there was something fishy hidden in it. The royal courtyard was where Lin Wan had prepared to get married and moved out of the royal palace to live. It was also where Fan Xian had climbed the wall countless times. However, if he wanted to climb it again, he would certainly be shot into a hedgehog by countless crossbow arrows. The defense around the courtyard was tight. The 4 streets along the courtyard had long been sealed off. It was like a large square. The courtyard was the small circle inside, and the outside was the Overwatch Council's tight blockade. Nominally, it was the eldest princess who was recuperating in that small circle, but the officials in court knew that this princess was imprisoned here by the emperor. The Overwatch Council watched her very closely. Not even a mosquito could fly in, so news could not come out. How long would she be imprisoned for? A carriage, accompanied by guards, slowly approached from the east. The owner of this carriage had entered the palace earlier but had not received any news. Thus, he was taking a great risk and coming to the royal courtyard in the west of the city. The driver was Ting Zijing. This carriage, with the Fan family's square and circle insignia, was coldly stopped half a street from the courtyard. The curtain was lifted slightly, revealing Lin Wan-er's tired and slightly sorrowful face. She had entered the palace to see the Empress Dowager but did not see the Empress. Although the Empress Dowager did not say anything, the atmosphere in the palace and the strangeness of certain details had already confirmed the suspicions in her heart. Regardless of whether it was from Fan Xian's point of view or the royal family's point of view, she should not have come to the courtyard today, even though it was her mother who was imprisoned inside. She could not help but come. She had a very inauspicious feeling that if she did not see that woman again, she would probably never have the opportunity to see her again in this life. How many years? Madam, the edict is clear. No one is allowed to disturb His Highness's rest, an official of the Overwatch Council said calmly. Why don't you go ask for an edict? After a few rounds of negotiations, Fan Manor's carriage still could not go any further. Lin Wan sighed and returned to the carriage. She knew that she should not have come, but she shook her head and said, I understand. The Overwatch Council official let out a sigh of relief and quickly bowed to express his thanks. If it had been any other official or noble who wanted to come to the courtyard to see the eldest princess, the people of the Overwatch Council would have long taken sticks and chased them out. However, the woman in the carriage was the eldest princess' own daughter. Most importantly, she was the wife of the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian. This latter identity made it so that no one in the Overwatch Council dared to be the slightest bit rude. Lin Wan-er didn't seem to hear what he was saying. She stared blankly at the familiar garden in the distance, and slowly lowered her head. Tears flowed uncontrollably from her eyes as she silently prayed for her mother. The fact that the eldest princess had been placed under house arrest naturally caused a great shock in the court. No one would underestimate the secret influence this woman had over the Qin court politics during these dozen years, as well as the control she and the people around her had over the court. Since the eldest princess had not died, no one knew what would happen in the future. Fortunately, the emperor had swiftly and decisively cleaned out the eldest princess faction and perfectly displayed an emperor's terrifying control and killing power. Not many people were worried that there would be any major changes in court politics. Some factions felt happy from the depths of their hearts, such as the Overwatch Council, the Hall of Governmental Affairs, and Taichung Temple. Many people felt afraid. They didn't know when they would be invited to the Overwatch Council for tea. Many people felt excited. They felt that it was not a waste of their lives to be able to see the emperor and princess, brother and sister, fall out with each other. There were also some people who felt sad and hurt. Sad and hurt for different reasons. For example, Lin Wan-er was sad because of her mother-daughter relationship. For others, it was because they had lost many opportunities to climb higher. However, everyone had a common understanding. Of all the factions, it should be the second prince who was the most terrified and sad. Fan Xian had used 2 years to bring the connection between the eldest princess and the second prince to the surface and beat the second prince's faction into a frenzy. Everyone knew that the second prince's true support was the eldest princess. Now that the eldest princess had lost power and been placed under house arrest, what would the second prince do? Not many people knew the relationship between the eldest princess and the crown prince, including the second prince. Thus, in the manner, the second prince was just as everyone guessed. He was shocked, sad, disappointed, hurt, and terrified. He crouched on the chair and unconsciously held a piece of pastry in his hand. He didn't send it into his mouth. His fingers tightened and squeezed the pastry loosely. His eyes unconsciously looked at the manor's front door. It seemed that at any moment, the eunuchs in the palace and officials of Taichung Temple would charge into the manor and capture him to house arrest. No matter what, the second prince could not understand why his father would suddenly attack his aunt. Furthermore, he was even more shocked by his father's silent attack and thunderous power. It was not until this moment that he finally understood that just because the emperor had not moved didn't mean he didn't have the power to move. It was just that he had been too lazy to move before. When the emperor moved, heaven and earth changed color. Silently, after a thunderstorm, the situation in Jingdo changed. The second prince didn't know what he was about to face. The emperor was very clear about his relationship with the eldest princess. Perhaps he would never have a chance to rise again in this life. He sighed and placed the pastry on the plate beside him. With a pained smile, he accepted the handkerchief and wiped his hands. Gazing at Wang Fei Yiling beside him, he said, "If there are any problems, presumably, for the sake of your great-uncle, father won't make things difficult for you." There was a faint layer of worry in Yiling-er's bright eyes. She knew why her husband had been obediently staying in the manor these few days, constantly preparing to be captured. However, she couldn't comfort him, nor could she do anything to help him. The power in the second prince's hands that he could rely on was the Yi family. In the days after the eldest princess was imprisoned, he didn't have any open or secret communication with the Yi family. He knew that each and every one of his actions was being watched by the palace. He was not prepared. More accurately, after his aunt was suddenly beaten into the dust, he didn't have the courage to do anything. He was worried that his strange actions would make his father even angrier. For the sake of his own life, it was better to be quiet. Imprisonment, at least, was not death. The second prince obediently waited for the arrival of the end in his manner. The people of Jingdo, up and down the court, were also waiting for the day the second prince was finished. Everyone waited for a long time, but there was still no edict from the royal palace. This reality inevitably made everyone feel puzzled and endlessly speculate. At this moment, an edict came out of the palace. Everyone was so shocked that they couldn't say a word. The news reached the manor. The second prince was so shaken by this edict that he fell straight off his chair. Boundless unexpected joy and boundless puzzlement turned into boundless shock in his mind. Why was this? The edict was written very clearly. The king of Nanzhao had just passed away. The emperor had specially ordered the crown prince, Li Chengxian, to go out on a tour on behalf of the emperor and to seal Nanzhao. Nanzhao? This was a vassal country that had been forcefully taken down by the Qing army 7 years ago. Its location was remote, there was a lot of poisonous miasma, and the roads were difficult to traverse. It was thousands of li away. A round trip would take at least 4 months. Although Nanzhao had been peaceful these years and saw the Qing kingdom as its master, the two countries had a close relationship. When the king of Nanzhao passed away, the Qing kingdom had to send a person of considerable status to mourn and attend the ceremony. But why the crown prince? This was completely against common etiquette. Why not the great prince? Why not Hu the scholar? Why not Fan Xian? At such a sensitive time, the crown prince was suddenly sent thousands of li away to Nanzhao. What did this mean? Could it be a form of exile? The eldest princess had been placed under house arrest. Everyone had thought that the second unlucky person would be the second prince. No one had expected it to be the crown prince. Did the emperor finally have the thought of dethroning the crown prince? Although the details of the current situation were not enough to support this judgment, the crafty officials in court all sensed that there was something strange in the wind. However, they could not understand it. The second prince himself was the person who could not understand it the most. He only felt a chill run through his entire body. His father's actions were always so unexpected and chilling. The way he did things was like flowing clouds in the sky. No matter how hard he tried, he could not figure out the traces. After the second prince's shock, he became even more well-behaved. Chapter 507. In the Jiangnan region far from Jingdo, the feeling of spring had already enveloped the willows of West Lake. By the side of West Lake, the color of spring was even stronger in the Ping family manor. A row of green trees along the back of the manor happily stretched their wastes, greedily sucking in the moisture in the air and the sunlight that warmed day by day. However, the owner of the manor was not very happy, nor did he have the leisure to stretch. With a bitter expression, he read through the council bulletins and court bulletins that Tianjing had recently sent over, and even the flowery newspaper the palace did. He still did not relax. In the end, he quietly discussed the news from Baoyue Brothel's channels with Shi Chanli and finally confirmed the path of development of the matter. It was just as the intelligence reports said. The eldest princess was under house arrest in the courtyard in the west of the city, and the crown prince had an imperial order to go to Nanzhao Kingdom thousands of li away to observe the ceremony. Currently, these were the two most direct results of the matter. Thus, the young owner of the manor couldn't help but sigh and repeatedly shake his head. Shi Chanli looked at him curiously and asked, "Sir, although I don't know why the emperor is angry, after this matter, the eldest princess will no longer be able to harm you in court or in Jiangnan. Is that not a great thing? Why are you still so unhappy?" Fan Xian looked at him with slanted eyes and swallowed his words a moment later. He waved his hand in boredom and said, "We'll talk about it later. You should hurry back to Suzhou and keep an eye on Baoyue Brothel." Shi Chanli left with a head full of confusion. Wang Qinian, who knew the inside story of this matter, flashed in. He stood quietly behind Fan Xian and watched as he once again examined all of the intelligence reports from Jingdo. He did not make a single sound. He didn't make a single sound because he knew why Fan Xian was troubled. I worked so hard to set up such a trap, yet in the end, this is the result, Fan Xian said somewhat helplessly. Fan Xian said somewhat helplessly, the danger this time was great. In the end, that woman still survived. Why exactly is this so? Wang Qinian glanced at him from the side and thought, after all, the eldest princess was his mother-in-law, so her words were inevitably a bit cold-blooded. To be able to stand between the eldest princess and the emperor and suppress the bomb that Fan Xian had used so much strength to detonate, it could only be that old man who had been deep in the palace for a long time. However, Fan Xian still had many questions and doubts about the process of this matter. Soft-hearted. He furrowed his brows as he spoke. These words were not only criticizing the emperor for holding back in the end, but they also represented his suspicions in a certain aspect. Why had the eldest princess not even made a decent counterattack before being so easily taken care of by the emperor? Even if he knew that the actions outside the palace were personally arranged by Director Chun, based on his understanding of his mother-in-law, for her to quietly allow herself to be captured, it really did not match her reputation as a madwoman. I told you, the eldest princess likes the emperor, Fan said. Fan Xian pursed his lips and said, I just didn't think she would be infatuated to such an extent. Before the emperor truly acted and had the intention to kill, she actually wouldn't actively resist. What kind of world is this? No. Fan had Fan. And Fan of Fan. He. With of Fan in. He. Fan, he of Fan said. Of, Fan of Fan, and said. And of Fan, of, he. No matter how arrogant or rebellious one was, no one dared to say such treasonous things in their own yard. Yet, Fan Xian had said it and said it in front of him, forcing him to listen. Wang Qinian coughed unhappily. He knew that his life, death, wealth, and honor in this life had long been tightly tied to Sir Fan Jr. Sir Fan Jr. was not worried at all that he would betray him, which was why he had spoken so impudently in front of him. The plan to expose the scandal of the royal family and force the emperor to take action had been made by Fan Xian and Wang Qinian. This was an important matter. The other members of the Qinian unit had not received a hint of it. As for Yan Bingyun, he was completely in the dark. Fortunately, Jiangnan was far from Jingdo. Fan Xian and Wang Qinian's plan only burst forth 2 months later. Even an immortal would not be able to guess that this matter had something to do with the two of them. Unless Hong Zhu suddenly had the courage to kill himself and his friend. There are a few places in the council report that are worth paying attention to. Although he had done something disloyal, Wang Qinian was still not used to talking about disloyal subject. He pointed painfully at a few places in the council report and forcefully changed the topic. He reminded, the arson case in Huichun Hall, the fall of a relative, and the sudden death of a royal doctor, there is something fishy about these 3 matters. Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at him. The council report did not connect these 3 matters. The palace would also not allow anyone with intentions to see the connection. The problem was that the 2 of them knew these 3 places too well. They knew the root of these matters. Do you not think that the eldest princess and crown prince killed to silence them? That is only medicine. Medicine cannot be considered evidence at all. The wrinkles on Wang Qinian's forehead were very deep. The eldest princess and crown prince are not stupid. Why would they do such foolish things during an investigation in the palace? This is also what I find strange. We kept these people alive for the emperor to interrogate. Fan Xian seemed to be deep in thought. But it is clear that the emperor did not interrogate them. How could he determine that matter? Also, he pointed at the paper and said seriously. The palace didn't find anything. The eldest princess probably won't take the blame. These 3 cases, who did it? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. Thinking about it now, it was indeed better for the third bureau to be dead than alive. His original plan did indeed have some problems in this segment. Now, what he was thinking about was who had helped turn this situation into a complete dead end, leaving the Emperor with no way to investigate and only able to rely on his own suspicions to make the final decision. When they were still in Jingdo, he and Wang Qinian had faintly sensed that there was a power that seemed to be doing something similar to what they were doing. However, at the time, they were afraid of alerting the enemy and did not investigate closely. It shouldn't be anyone else. Wang Qinian sighed. Fan Xian also sighed and shook his head. Other than the one of us, there is no one else. The crown prince has gone to Nanzhao. The study did not remain calm for long. Fan Xian spoke of the question lingering in his heart. Based on the time, he should have already passed Yingzhou and continued south. Why do you think the emperor made this arrangement? The officials in the court must still be guessing, not understanding why the crown prince would be implicated in the matter of the eldest princess, but you and I are certain that His Majesty will not tolerate a son who shamed the royal family to inherit the throne. Going to Nanzhao to attend the ceremony, will Chengxian be able to come back? Wang Qinian was silent, not daring to answer this question. Fan Xian smiled and glanced at him. You and I have done who knows how many things that implicate the 9 clans. There is no harm in discussing it. Wang Qinian forced a smile. He knew that Fan Xian was once again reminding him of how shameless his intentions were. He shook his head and said, I don't think anything will happen along the way. Even if the emperor has the intention of deposing the heir, he would not choose this time to throw it out. That makes sense. Fan Xian gently slapped the table. My thoughts are the same as mine. Our emperor wants to be wise and powerful, to leave his name in the annals of history. He has done everything he can to suppress this matter, and does not want it to become a laughing stock. The crown prince's trip to Nanzhao this time is to get him out of Jingdo and slowly plan the deposing of the heir. The second reason is... He furrowed his brows and suddenly thought of the poisonous fog that pervaded Nanzhao. 7 or 8 years ago, when Yan Xiaoi led the army to conquer the south, the casualties of the soldiers were all because of this scourge. The miasma has invaded the body, the crown prince's body is gradually weakening. Wang Qinian said this and suddenly realized that he was indeed becoming more and more daring. Fan Xian forced a smile and continued, If it really is what you and I think, the emperor is indeed powerful. A complicated expression flashed through his eyes, but Wang Qinian did not notice it. Regretfully, it was not completely successful. Fan Xian sighed. Why do you think the eldest princess did not die? This was the second time today that he had openly expressed regret. Wang Qinian felt it was strange. The eldest princess had already lost power. After all, he was her son-in-law. Regardless of whether it was from the perspective of human relations, he should not have said such things. Wang Qinian didn't know that ever since Fan Xian entered Jingdo, he had unconsciously feared the eldest princess. When dealing with other people, he could use schemes and power to compete. However, when dealing with a powerful figure praised by the world as crazy, it was difficult for Fan Xian to guess what kind of crazy reaction she would have. This kind of uncertainty gave Fan Xian a headache. Particularly with the change in the Jingdo Palace, Fan Xian still found it difficult to believe such an ending. The eldest princess was on the brink of death, so why did her powers not carry out a final counterattack? What about the elders of the military? What about Yan Xiaoi's attitude? If the matter had happened too quickly and the military did not have time to react, then what about Yi Luyun? Fan Xian knew better than anyone about Yi Luyun's position in the Juanshang conference. In Suzhou, he had also been scared out of his wits by that broken-down sword. Even if the Juanshang Conference was a loose organization, the eldest princess would certainly not be as weak as it seemed now. Earlier, he had analyzed the eldest princess's crazy and abnormal love for the emperor with Wang Qinian. That was just an excuse Wang Qinian used to convince himself. He did not believe it. However, there were some things in this world that perhaps people did not believe were the truest reasons. Fan Xian sat by the desk and sighed regretfully. After Wang Qinian left, he still couldn't stop sighing. Wang Qinian closed the door and unconsciously shook his head. He thought to himself that although the eldest princess had not died, from now on, no one in court would be a match for Commissioner Fan. This kind of result was already very good, so why did the commissioner sigh? In reality, the reason was very simple. Fan Xian was not a loyal official, nor was he a pure official. What he imagined was just watching the tigers and cranes fight in Jiangnan and each get hurt. He wanted the eldest princess to fall from power, but he also did not believe the emperor. What he sighed was that the emperor's methods seemed to have come faster and more powerful than he had imagined. The emperor's power had not been damaged at all. Fan Xian sat alone in the study and silently analyzed everything that had happened in Jingdou. He faintly felt that perhaps the eldest princess was stubbornly waiting for the emperor's thunderous anger because of her crazy feelings. It was clear that the emperor was holding back. Was it familial love? Fan Xian did not believe this. He flipped open the letters under the council newspaper. After reading them a second time, he thought deeply for a moment and then began to write a reply. The letters came from his home in Jingdou. There was one for his father and one for Wanner. They mainly talked about Cici and the child in her stomach. They were all safe and did not need to worry too much. However, Wanner's letter mentioned the eldest princess matter. Although she did not explicitly say anything, it seemed that she wanted Fan Xian to say something in the palace. Fan Xian once again sighed in distress. He knew that his wife was a rare intelligent person. She knew how irreconcilable everything was behind the cover-up. However, she still wrote a letter for him to say something. This only proved that Wanner still had a mother-daughter relationship with the eldest princess. This was a very natural thing. The emperor was cold-blooded. Fan Xian was cold-blooded. It did not mean that everyone in the royal family was cold-blooded. Fan Xian wrote his reply seriously. To his father, he had to express his shock and confusion. To Wanner, his reply was mainly to comfort her. At the same time, he asked about Cici. Following this, he began to write a memorial, a secret memorial to the emperor. Although he did not directly plead for leniency for the eldest princess, he faintly expressed the concern that a son should have. After he finished writing, he looked it over carefully a few times and confirmed that this kind of attitude would not make the emperor think he was hypocritical or make the emperor angry. He sealed it with wax and had his subordinates send it through the first-class mail route. After doing all this, only then did Fan Xian relax slightly. Although he had been free and unfettered in Jiangnan these few months, his gaze had always been fixed on Jingdou. The mental pressure was great. Although the matter was not coordinated, it was basically proceeding according to his plans. He finally relaxed a little. Pulling open a drawer in the secret room, he took out the process of the 3 workshops of the palace treasury that 7th Yi and he had spent more than a year copying out and spaced out. Although this process was not everything in the palace treasury, Fan Xian knew that if this thing actually made its way to northern Qi, it would have terrifying consequences. He narrowed his eyes and thought to himself that although he and Chen Pingping had unconsciously worked together to play the emperor once, in the end, they had only played around with the details. As for the larger picture, perhaps it was the emperor playing with him. 13th Wang has been idle for too long, Fan Xian thought. Fan Xian thought of this. He then got up, packed everything, and left the manor by West Lake. Chapter 508. I've been having heart palpitations lately, and it's hard for me to concentrate on writing. Please forgive me. I'll take a day off next week to comfort myself. Thank you. As for the book review section, I don't mind criticism, really. Of course, it's up to you whether you agree or not. Regardless of whether you are a debater or a debater, you can say whatever you want, but can't you be a little more gentle? Please try your best to maintain the peace in the book review section. Sorry to trouble everyone, please. It was right next to the West Lake in Hangzhou. It was almost dusk. The scenery of the lake and the mountains blended into the golden light. It was indescribably beautiful. In this patch of dusk, Fan Xian, alone, came to the top of a hill by the lake. Looking at the young man holding the green banner, he tilted his head and said, "I heard you've been telling fortunes in Hangzhou recently and have received the favor of a few young ladies of large families?" The young man holding the green banner was the last disciple of Sigujian in Dongyi, the 9th-level ace who had helped Fan Xian kill Yan Shendu. Fan Xian had always felt that the existence of this person, as well as his subsequent assistance to him, was somewhat absurd. It was like one of those avant-garde dramas he had heard of in his previous life. No matter how he savored it, it left a strange taste in his mouth. Although Sigujian, that idiot, seemed to have thought things through clearly, Fan Xian still felt that this matter was too ridiculous. Although not many people in the world knew of the relationship between 13th Wang and Sigujian, if Fan Xian turned hostile and denied it, how would Sigujian explain it to the eldest princess or Yan Xiaoi? 13th Wang's face was facing the direction of West Lake. The faint golden light reflected off his handsome face, plating it with a comforting glow. It was very warm. "Now, the entire Jiangnan knows that I'm an expert under your command." The young man smiled amiably and said, "Naturally, the officials will also give me some face. This fortune-telling business is definitely not bad." A light breeze blew across the surface of the lake and moved up the trees at the foot of the hill. It only slightly moved a corner of the green banner in 13th Wang's hand. It just happened to reveal the words, "Iron Minister." After experiencing the storm of Zhaoshang Money House taking over the Ming family's shares, the people who had been in Ming Garden at the time had already guessed that the young man standing behind the shopkeeper of Zhaoshang Money House was an ace Sir Fan Jr. had used to monitor the money house. The trusted aide of the imperial envoy was naturally doing very well in the Jiangnan area. "Fortunately, you don't have the habit of harming innocent girls." Fan Xian smiled and stood beside him. Tilting his head to glance at him, a complicated emotion rose in his heart. On the green hill by the lake, the surface of the lake reflected golden light and the smooth face. This scene made Fan Xian involuntarily think of many years ago on the cliff in Danzhou. The man closest to him in the world seemed to also be surrounded by a ball of light. The man with the black cloth seemed to be saying goodbye to a certain place. What about 13th Wang? Fan Xian unconsciously shook his head. He didn't understand why he was used to associating this friend with the blind uncle. He missed Wu Zhu very much, particularly in such a peaceful situation in Jiangnan. He didn't know if Uncle Wu Zhu's injury had recovered or not. Even Chen Pingping didn't know where Wu Zhu was hiding to recover. What kind of injury would take more than a year to recover from? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. 13th Wang glanced at him curiously and asked, "Sir Fan, is there something on your mind?" "Yes." Fan Xian did not hesitate and said straightforwardly, "I have something I need your help with." "What is it?" "The Crown Prince is heading in the direction of Nanzhao. The road is shrouded in poisonous fog, and the path is dangerous. I am worried about his body," Fan Xian said with a calm expression. 13th Wang furrowed his brows slightly. His breathing became slightly heavier. After thinking for a long time, he slowly said, "The Imperial Army, the Overwatch Council, and the Qing Kingdom's Tiger Guards. This kind of defense is very tight. Even if I die, I might not be able to get close to his body." Fan Xian smiled. You misunderstand what I mean. 13th Wang looked at him and didn't say anything. Help me bring an antidote pill to him. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly, as if he was avoiding the thickening golden light on the surface of the lake. Help me protect him in secret and ensure his safety along the way. 13th Wang's brows furrowed even tighter. He had no idea why Fan Xian would suddenly give him this mission. After hesitating for a moment, he quietly said, "Why? Given my understanding of the situation in Jingdo, the eldest princess is under house arrest, and it is clear that the crown prince is about to lose power. Under the Qing emperor, there is no one who can stand against you." Fan Xian smiled. He didn't know how to explain, so he decided not to explain. What exactly happened in Jingdo? 13th Wang asked curiously like a child. This matter wouldn't have anything to do with you, would it? He unconsciously used the honorific you. Fan Xian spat and said without good humor, "I'm in Jiangnan. No matter how long my hands are, they can't reach Jingdo." 13th Wang thought for a bit and agreed with this explanation. He scratched his head and said, "But the crown prince is heading all the way south. It looks like your emperor has some thoughts. Sir Fan, you want me to protect him. Have you guessed something? But, if I guessed correctly, by doing this, aren't you opposing the emperor of your country?" Presently, I have long become a secret that everyone knows. To openly oppose your emperor like this, are you not worried? Forget it, don't guess blindly. Fan Xian sighed. This matter has nothing to do with the emperor. It is purely a request from Wanner's letter. After all, I am half a member of the royal family, so I have to pay a price. 13th Wang smiled. He knew that what he said was a lie, but he didn't expose it. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and glanced at him. Don't laugh like a rabbit. Looking at it now, you're not an idiot either. 13th Wang spread out his hands and said, "When have I ever been an idiot? When you killed the little archer." Fan Xian had long learned from 13th Wang about the specifics of the night attack on Yuantai camp. He knew of 13th Wang's bravery that day and had let out countless sighs of admiration. Now, he repeated it again. Brave warriors die very easily. 13th Wang smiled self-mockingly. I'm probably only used to this kind of battle style. For some reason, Fan Xian suddenly thought of Lin Qingxia's role as the valiant general. Absurdly, he laughed to himself. Then, under 13th Wang's confused gaze, he gently patted his shoulder. Your teacher wants you to follow me, presumably for something many years in the future. Since it is so, it is best if you value your life more. On the Nanzhao line, just follow in secret. It would be best if you don't have to fight. He was silent for a moment and then said, I'm not threatening you. However, the Ming family is now in my hands. The power to the east road of the palace treasury is also in my hands. You should know that during these 2 months, my cooperation with your teacher has been good, so please help me with this small favor. Watching the green banner disappear into the golden willows by the lakeside, Fan Xian fell silent. He crouched down and sat down on the green hill. He looked at the beautiful West Lake and the broken bridge that did not exist and had never existed in a daze. If Wang Qinian, who knew the inside story, knew of his plans, he would certainly be scared half to death and think he had lost his mind. However, Fan Xian knew he was not crazy. In the past, he wanted to bring down the Crown Prince because if the Crown Prince succeeded, he would not have good days. To protect the Crown Prince's life now, he had to create trouble for the Qing Emperor. Once the eldest princess and the Crown Prince completely died, there would be no buffer between him and the Emperor. A reduction in power would immediately come. Fan Xian was more worried about the safety of Chen Pingping and Fan Jian. Fan Xian knew that the Qing Emperor was a person who cared a lot about his reputation. From the incident in the royal palace, it was evident that the emperor had killed hundreds of people in the palace in order to cover up a scandal of the royal family. He had also tossed out the long-suppressed island massacre in the East Sea and the details of betraying Yen Bingyun. Thus, the eldest princess' downfall had a solid reason. However, the emperor had gone around in circles. It meant that he did not want his reputation to suffer any damage. This was not a scandal of the royal family. It was a scandal of the eldest princess. That was all. The arrangements regarding the crown prince also made this clear. Presumably, the emperor was having a headache over how to depose the heir. He did not want to slap himself in the face. The crown prince had behaved innocently and peacefully these 2 years. What excuse could the emperor find? Many things would certainly happen on the trip to Nanzhao. Fan Xian had sent 13th Wang, a variable, to digest a portion of those things. Fan Xian was not stupid enough to protect the crown prince again. He just wanted to create some trouble for the emperor so that he would not notice him, Zhaoshang Money House, or the 2 elders behind him so early. He missed Uncle Wu Zhu. He knew that there were many people he cared about in the Qin kingdom. For these people, he had to stay here. If it was just Fan Xian alone, he would not be afraid or worried about anything. Even if he broke off relations with the emperor, he could still be arrogant and pretentiously raise his middle finger at the royal palace. In the eyes of the second prince and many clever people, everything around Fan Xian was actually power on paper and would not be able to withstand a single blow. He knew that the people of this world all had a natural worship toward imperial power. Putting aside the Overwatch Council, even his Qinian unit and Sir Yen Jr., who was far away in Jingdo, might stand against him because of an edict. However, even if everything around him was taken away by the emperor's edict, he would not be afraid. He would not be correct. He had the heart of a modern person that had stopped for a long time. He never had a sliver of fear toward things like imperial power. He had the ability to consult with 7th Yi and organize a set of palace treasury processes. He was himself a 9th level ace skilled in killing people. He still had the chest, the 419 Emperor's lover, and Uncle Wu Zhu. Fan Xian sat silently on the green hill beside West Lake and narrowed his eyes at the red sunset clouds in the distance. He thought to himself, if one day he was forced to raise his middle finger at the royal palace, what a spectacular scene it would be. The kingdom of Qing was the most powerful nation in the world. The eldest princess, Li Yunrui, had hidden behind the Qing emperor and done many things in the past decade. She had secretly obtained countless benefits from the other 2 great powers. For example, she had used the murder of Assistant Minister Fan's illegitimate son by assassins from northern Qi and Dongyi to start a war again, seizing a large portion of northern Qi's territory. She had also backhandedly sold Yen Bingyun to northern Qi in exchange for Shaoen's return to the north. This had thrown the northern Qi court into chaos, and the factions of the emperor and empress had once again clashed. Miraculously, the eldest princess, the Empress Dowager of Northern Qi, and Sigujian of Dongyi had always maintained a good relationship. There was even a lot of cooperation regarding the palace treasury. He didn't know what those foreigners were thinking. No matter how they thought about it, the eldest princess's sudden imprisonment brought a violent shock to many places in the world. It made many people begin to think of useless things, such as Fan Xian beginning to shift his strategic focus to the Son of Heaven. In northern Qi and Dongyi, the lofty people would also give their own judgment. The great grandmaster in Dongyi had sent the last disciple he was most proud of to Fan Xian's side. He didn't know that this last disciple had been sent by Fan Xian to be a bodyguard. Of course, he didn't care about this right now. He was only concerned about the eldest princess' imprisonment. The air of spring was thick. The air of spring was thick, but Dongyi, located by the sea, was filled with a salty and wet smell. The warm currents and wind on the sea blew gently all year round, so the people in the city did not feel much gratitude toward this air of spring. In the center of Dongyi was the manor of the master of the city. It took up a large amount of land. The master of the city was responsible for all the specific business in the city. In this large and prosperous city, the so-called government affairs were actually business affairs. Problems with public security rarely appeared because there were no great bandits who dared to make a move in a place with the most ninth-level aces in the world. Other than the young Wang Qinian, everyone knew that the place that truly guided Dongyi forward and decided its survival was not in the manor of the master of the city. Instead, it was in the stretch of grass huts outside the city. The grass huts formed a concave shape. Strangely, the opening did not face the main road. On the contrary, it was against the large mountain in the back. If someone wanted to enter the grass huts, they would need to go around to the back of the mountain and follow the mountain path down. According to legend, this was the easiest way for Sigujien to test visitors. In the center of the concave grass huts was a large pit. The pit was filled with the swords left behind by the aces who had come to challenge Sigujien and ask for his guidance. Like a chaotic forest, they pierced toward the sky. It was not easy to become a great grandmaster who had just emerged. Fortunately, the trend of this challenge finally ended after the large pit gradually filled up. No one would be stupid enough to challenge Sigujien again. As for those who were that stupid, they had already died in the grass huts. This was the holy land that all martial artists worshipped, revered, and yearned for in their hearts, the Sword Hut. Some people also called it the Sword Grave. It was a beautiful name with a high realm. However, Sigujien would only use one name to describe the holy land beside his residence: the Sword Pit. "This is a pit," a mocking voice rang out from the grass hut. The owner of the voice seemed to be very young. The Qing Emperor, that bastard, and Li Yunrui, that crazy woman, do they really think I am an idiot? Chapter 509. Ingxiu's classmate confirms he is safe. Thank you, thank you. The voice in the grass hut was full of mockery and an almost arrogant sense of arrogance. It viciously criticized the high and mighty brother and sister of the Qing kingdom and said, "House arrest? Only an idiot would believe it. The two of them, one a god and the other a ghost, have been together for a dozen years. How could they suddenly turn against each other? If they turn against each other, they have to find a reason. Do the reasons the Qing court has thrown out now count as reasons?" Yun Jilan's knees hurt a little. He knew that his teacher was talking happily and had clearly forgotten he was still kneeling. He rubbed his knees and climbed up. His face was full of a bitter smile. He thought to himself that most of the time, his teacher's life appeared absurd, but he always had an admirable patience when it came to the big picture. In some small details, he also had a stroke of genius, such as his little brother disciple. However, his teacher's words had clearly become absurd again. Did he think that the major event that had happened in Jingdo was purely the Qing emperor and eldest princess, who had nothing better to do and were willing to lose the face of the royal family to put on a show for the world to see? No matter what, Yun Jilan would not believe this. He said a few words to express his opinion. The great grandmaster in the sword hut fell silent. It was as if he felt that there was indeed something wrong with his judgment. In his heart, the Qing people, particularly the Qing royal family, were, without question, the dirtiest, most shameless, filthiest, lowliest, and black-bellied creatures in the world. It was not an easy matter for him to believe that such a large crack had appeared in the Qing royal family. He unconsciously thought that the Qing kingdom was preparing to make him a scapegoat again. This thought made him angry and sad. Thus, he was unable to listen to Yun Jilan's words. As the leading disciple of Sigujien of Dongyi, other than the 2 times he had been invited by the eldest princess to the Qing kingdom without success, Yun Jilan represented his teacher's will the rest of the time. He cooperated with the master of Dongyi and maintained the peace of this city and the surrounding small countries. When it came to government affairs, he was much more astute than the great grandmaster known to the world as an idiot. Ever since the incident in Jingdo, he had acutely sensed that there seemed to be an opportunity in front of Dongyi. If they could grasp this opportunity, Dongyi's greatest threat could be eliminated. They would no longer have to be like a tree sitting on the fence, sacrificing themselves between the nobles of the Qing kingdom. In particular, the fact that the eldest princess was not dead made Yun Jilan even more certain of his judgment, and he very sincerely repeated it to his master. The grass hut once again fell silent. Sigujien didn't speak again. He was silent. After a long time, the voice slowly said, "We cannot interfere right now. Who knows if it is a trap?" Yun Jilan expressed that he understood, but he was smiling bitterly in his heart. He didn't understand that the great swordsman in the hut, that idiotic grandmaster, was not only afraid of the Qing kingdom's evilness. More importantly, if Dongyi wanted to use the Qing kingdom's internal strife, they needed a good opportunity. As the most powerful country in the world, this kind of opportunity could not be created by outsiders. They could only wait for the people inside the Qing kingdom to send out an invitation. Regardless of whether it was Sigujien or Ku He, they were both towering trees outside of the Qing kingdom. These two trees could not easily express their attitudes or dance with the wind in the mountains. Once they went in one direction, it would not be easy to come back. Continue to watch and see what the Qing people are playing. The voice in the grass hut rang out again, giving an order to Yun Jilan. However, he didn't tell his disciple. For a long time, certain people in the Qing kingdom had been able to pass on important information to him through certain channels. Now, he was weighing this information. "Yes, teacher." Yun Jilan prepared to go to the manor of the master of the city to discuss when he suddenly thought of something. Turning around, he furrowed his brows and said, "The eldest princess of the Qing kingdom has already lost power. Fan Xian should be safe. In order to prevent anyone from discovering his identity, should we summon him back?" The last disciple of Dongyi Sigujien, 13th Wang, who held the green banner, had always been a mysterious figure. During these 2 years, many people, including Yun Jilan, only knew that his teacher loved this young disciple dearly. They had never had the opportunity to enter the hut to see what this young disciple looked like. It was only during the Jiangnan Ming family's competition for merchants that Yun Jilan learned for the first time that his teacher had sent his disciple to Fan Xian's side. Yun Jilan did not understand. More than that, he felt faintly uncomfortable. After all, within the Qing court, the young man surnamed Fan had always been Dongyi's greatest enemy. During these years, he had ruined countless things for Dongyi and killed countless people. Even Yun Jilan himself had almost died to the Overwatch Council's assassination. The aces and assassins of Dongyi had fought guerrilla warfare with the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council in Jiangnan for half a year. Although Yun Jilan accepted his teacher's change in attitude toward Fan Xian, he felt a little conflicted in his heart. "I know what you're thinking," the voice in the grass hut said mockingly. "You still think it's wrong for me to help Fan Xian. Actually, you're wrong. It's not that Fan Xian needs our help, it's that we need Fan Xian to accept our help. Li Yunrui's side is already finished, at least on the palace treasury side. We need Fan Xian. In reality, the Ming family has already been finished these few months, but it has not affected Dongyi. What does this mean? It means that Fan Xian has already accepted our help." Yun Jilan lowered his head slightly and said, "But, in this way, at least 30% of our channels are under Fan Xian's control. This young noble of the Qing kingdom has always turned hostile like flipping a book. Once he becomes ruthless, it will not be easy to deal with. Why would he be moved?" In the grass hut, Sigujien's analysis walked the path of wisdom and was not muddled at all. In the past, the two sides only fought on a small scale and did not touch upon their root. The reason there was conflict at that time was because of Li Yunrui in the middle. Now that Li Yunrui has been imprisoned, There is no longer any conflict of interest between Fan Xian and me. Why would he take the risk of a complete fallout and be moved? Yun Jilan's heart jumped. He understood his teacher's words, between Fan Xian and me. Didn't this mean that his teacher had already, at least on the surface, admitted that Fan Xian, that young man, had the right to sit on equal footing with him? In the past, we could trade with Li Yunrui. Now we can trade with Fan Xian. The voice in the grass hut rang out again. In the entire Qing court, the only people who do not fear the Qing emperor are these two. Remember, the Qing kingdom is not Fan Xian's. He has no reason to sacrifice his own interests for the benefit of the Qing kingdom. Yun Jilan thought about it and still did not understand. If Fan Xian was present, he would certainly give the grass hut a thumbs up and praise the idiot brother-disciple for his high EQ. Before the incident, I had your disciple throw his lot in with Fan Xian. This is the so-called attitude. The voice in the grass hut paused. The attitude has to be in place. So, let your disciple do things himself. Yun Jilan furrowed his brows slightly. He thought that mysterious and pitiful disciple had been thrown out by his teacher to work hard for Fan Xian. Was it just to express his attitude toward Donnie? Of course, I had him go to the Qing kingdom for another reason. Yun Jilan's spirit rose. He didn't know what secrets he would hear next. The words that entered his ears startled him. After thinking for a while, he realized that the matter was indeed as it was. There was nothing more important than this matter. When the Northern Qi royal family rebelled, why was that Northern Qi woman able to hold her son and sit firmly on the throne and turn a wailing Northern Qi into what it is today? Because Ku He stood on her side. Why is it that Dongyi and the other countries are sandwiched between the two most powerful countries in the world, wavering left and right, suffering for the best, losing tribute and taking in silver? Why is it that the Qing kingdom's ruler and people are so ambitious, but they have never tried to use their powerful martial power to swallow Dongyi into their stomachs? Yun Jilan did not even need to think. With a glimmer of reverence he said, "Because Dongyi has you and the sword in your hand." Correct. Although the title of Great Grandmaster is meaningless, it is good to use it to scare people and as a killing weapon. The voice in the grass hut suddenly became lonely. Have you ever thought about what the world would be like if Ku He died and I died? Yun Jilan felt a chill run down his back. As for such a scene, it was something that everyone in the world had thought about. However, no one dared to say it aloud. They knew that given the Qing kingdom's powerful military power and the hot-bloodedness of conquering borders rooted in the hearts of the Qing people, once two great grandmasters who did not belong to the Qing kingdom died, the entire world would certainly sink into chaos again. Putting aside Northern Qi, at least Dongyi would find it difficult to keep. He said sincerely and firmly, "Teacher, you will not die." What a joke! Who doesn't die in this world? The voice in the grass hut became more and more lonely. Even if I don't die, people will grow old. Ku He is already so old, and I am not young either. Do you think that an old man at the end of his life, when he can't even hold a sword in his trembling hand, is still a great grandmaster? But what does this have to do with little disciple entering the Qing kingdom? Yun Jilan was silent for a moment and then asked the question in his heart. There have never been any great grandmasters in the world, the great grandmaster in the grass hut said coldly. The great grandmaster in the straw hut said coldly, "It's just that since more than 30 years ago, we monsters have gradually appeared. There weren't any in the past, and I don't know if there will be any in the future. But at least for now, among the young experts in the world, there are only a handful of people who have the chance to approach this realm." Yun Jilan's heart jumped slightly as he watched the calmly closed door of the grass hut. The voice in the door laughed. "It's a pity that you are old. It is very difficult for this to be possible. Many people have crawled out of the sword pit in Dongyi, including the most ninth-level aces in the world. If you want to talk about who has the opportunity to become a new generation of strange creatures, perhaps only your little disciple is. Yun Jilan opened his mouth slightly. He had once met 13th Wang face to face in Suzhou's Zhaoshang Money House. At the time, he had learned that this little disciple had already entered the 9th level at such a young age. He had been very shocked, but he had always felt that his little disciple's realm was far from his. How was it that in his teacher's mouth, he was the person most likely to enter the great grandmaster realm? This is a problem of one's nature. Sigujian's voice finally became as confident and indifferent as a great grandmaster's. If one desires something to the extreme, one must not care about something. You can't, and the knife-wielding master under Ku, he called Lang Tiao, also can't. Actually, these years, presumably, Ku he and I have both been troubled by the problem we spoke of earlier. Once we grow old and die, what will happen to the land behind us? Thus, we have to resolve this problem before we die. I chose your little disciple, Ku he. He chose Haitang. Coincidentally, they are each other's last disciples. Even more coincidentally, Ku he sent Haitang to Fan Xian's side. Sigujian's voice carried a glimmer of mockery. Even if it wasn't him who sent her, at least he must be very happy that something happened between Haitang and Fan Xian. Since he could send her, I could also send her. However, Haitang is a girl. This is a great advantage. Yun Jilan was dumbstruck. He had no idea how the great grandmaster's plan to raise Fan Xian was brought up. He didn't understand why Ku he and his teacher, these two great grandmasters, would send their last disciples one by one to Fan Xian's side. Are there really only 4 strange creatures in the world? Sigujian asked in a quiet voice. Yes, perhaps there are only 4 strange creatures. That strange creature never seems to age. You should know him, that blind man. Yun Jilan's heart grew cold. He knew that his teacher was talking about a mysterious figure who had secretly traveled through Dongyi many years ago. But you don't know that Fan Xian is that blind man's disciple. The person in the grass hut smiled. Isn't this a very interesting matter? The last disciples of strange creatures should all be together. Fighting and talking will allow the 3 of them to improve greatly. This is the so-called training. Of course, presumably, Ku he is thinking the same as me. He wants his disciple to go to Fan Xian's side to get a bit of good luck. Luck? Yun Jilan stared at the tightly closed door of the grass hut. What kind of conditions are needed to become an old strange creature? Intelligence, cleverness, hard work, but, most importantly, luck, Sigujian sighed. There are countless cultivators in the world. In the end, only a few people succeed. Is it the heavens being unfair, or is it something else? In reality, it is just that our luck is a bit better than other people's. In the end, he said, what happened 30 years ago was already proven. To become a great grandmaster, one must have this kind of luck. Then, one must try with the blind man. However, no one can find where the blind man is. Since it is so, then one can only try the blind man's last disciple. Yun Jilan was confused by these mysterious words. A moment later, he asked the question he was most concerned about. Little brother disciple, Haitang, Fan Xian. Teacher, of these 3, who do you think is most likely to succeed? Among these 3 top aces of the younger generation, other than 13th Wang who was still a nobody, Haitang and Fan Xian stood, without question, at the peak of their age group. At such an age, they had already entered the 9th level. Each of them had a good teacher. Furthermore, at different times of time, people always thought they were Tianmai. Thus, when people discussed who would be the next great grandmaster, the first thing they thought of was Fan Xian and Haitang duo. Haitang. Sigujian's judgment came very simply. Because she is very good, she is very fast. Then youngest disciple? It is also possible that the clarity of that child's nature is not below Haitong's. What about Fan Xian? The person in the grass hut was silent for a moment. Fan Xian is the least likely. Why? Although he loathed Fan Xian, Yun Jilan still unconsciously raised an objection. Although his realm is still lingering around the 9th level and is very unstable, not as good as Haitang Duo, given the speed of his improvement, it is truly inhuman. According to my observations, it is rare to see a young person as determined as him in this world. As for hard work, although he was born into a powerful family, he has cultivated continuously since he was young and has endured hardship. All the conditions are met, but Fan Xian is missing the most important link, Sigujian concluded. He has no heart. This young man has no heart for this world. Since he has no heart, naturally there is no nature to speak of. If he wants to enter the realm of the heavenly path, he will have to give up everything in his hands. Is he willing to do that? Fan Xian was a normal person, so he was unwilling. Although the blind man is an extraordinary person and can bring luck to his opponents, his own luck is not very good. Furthermore, he cannot be a good teacher, Sigujian said in the end. I miss the blind man very much. It is a pity that after disappearing for a dozen years, he came out to find Ku He, that big baldy. Yes, it is a pity. Yun Jilan heard the sound of a sword being unsheathed in the hut. Among the great grandmasters, Yi Lu Yun was a carefree person who never took on disciples. Sigujian, on the other hand, took on a wide range of disciples. If one included those who were registered, there were at least 50. Thus, the levels of his disciples were mixed. Although there was a 9th-level ace like Yun Jilan and a mysterious young man like 13th Wang, there were still many who did not make it. As for the Northern Qi imperial advisor Ku He didn't take many disciples. Each one of them was a top ace, such as the Northern Qi Emperor's martial teacher, the 9th-level ace Lang Tiao, and Haitang Duo, who wore flowery clothing and was known as the Tianmai being. The blind Uncle Wu Zhu also had disciples. However, his first disciple and last disciple were both the same person, Fan Xian. What Sigujian said was correct. The great grandmasters were also people. They also had to consider the problems behind them. Thus, these strange creatures all put a great deal of effort into their last disciples. Of course, they only did so in secret. They didn't want this pressure to interfere with their disciples' cultivation. Haitang, Fan Xian, and 13th Wang had yet to appear in the same place at the same time. If there was such a day, it would certainly be an interesting sight. Chapter 510. I've read all the book reviews, really. I just want to make one thing clear. After all, everyone is reading for leisure. Don't ruin your mood because of the debate. There are many important things in the world. Writing a book is my job. I'll try my best to write it well. Everyone should enjoy reading. The problem now is that everyone is fighting fiercely. I can't even press the add essence button. I'm truly sorry. Presumably, everyone doesn't care about these few essences, so I'll take this opportunity to slack off. P.S. I'm taking a day off on Thursday. Thank you, everyone. Northern Qi's spring came a little late, but it would still come. Not far from Shangjing, the capital of Northern Qi, one had to walk around the desolate Topaz West Mountain and then head north for a few hours before coming to a quiet and secluded mountain. This mountain was not very tall, but the tall trees and shrubs on the mountain were densely packed. It appeared particularly primitive and quiet. Layers of light and dark green intermingled. It was very beautiful. Just like the sword hut's position in the hearts of the swordsmen of the world, this green mountain, in the eyes of the Northern Qi people and the ascetic cultivators who traveled the world, was also an inviolable and lofty holy land. This nameless green mountain was the location of Northern Qi's Tiani Dao and the place where Imperial Advisor Ku He cultivated. Walking along the rugged mountain path toward the quiet and secluded mountain valley, one could faintly see the place where tens of thousands of pine trees gathered. Tens of thousands of pine trees. The shape of the pine needles and the width of the trees were all different. Some of the pine needles were soft and floated down like strands of hair. Some of the pine needles were angry and hard enough to pierce the heavens. Some of the pine needles were like thin and round tubes. They were particularly interesting. It was early morning. Morning dew covered the plants in the mountain. After the dew moistened the pine needles, it slid to the ground. Only the pine trees with dense pine needles would store puddles of crystalline dew in their branches and leaves. Reflecting the morning light, they were as clear as gemstones. Following the faint light of the dew into the mountains, one could see the buildings of Tianyi Taoist School. These buildings inherited the traditional aesthetic style of the Wei Kingdom and Northern Qi. They were mainly green and black. Black represented sternness, while green was close to nature. They stood between heaven and earth, their power hidden within their beauty. Although Tianyi Dao's sect did not accept disciples as widely as Dongyi's sword hut, Master Ku He's quiet cultivation attracted countless pilgrims who came to worship him. No matter how few disciples the imperial advisor took, adult disciples such as Lang Tiao still had to take in disciples. After a few decades, the number of people in the sect had gradually increased. Now, there were more than 100 people who spent many years cultivating and studying in Qing Mountain. In the hearts of these disciples, of course, they hoped that they could cultivate in seclusion in the mountains for many years, and then go out to bring prosperity to the world, just like that fairy in their hearts. Back in the day, the Northern Qi saint girl, Haitang Duoduo, had cultivated in seclusion for countless years under these pine trees. Before Haitang Duoduo left the mountain, she had planted vegetables in a garden on the outskirts of those greenish-black buildings. Other than what she consumed, the rest of the vegetables were sent to the school. To this day, there were still many disciples who felt proud to have eaten the vegetables Haitang had personally grown. During this year, Haitang spent most of her time in the distant Qin kingdom's Jiangnan with the equally famous Sir Fan Jr. This reality made the people of Northern Qi angry, particularly the Tianyi Dao students in Qing Mountain. Other than jealousy and anger, what made these students most unhappy was that it was very difficult to see the flower-clothed girl in the garden again. In the past, as long as they saw the girl's figure, everyone's heart would calm down. Not long after Haitang left, another girl moved into the garden. At the same time, she turned the vegetables in the garden into medicinal herbs that could be grown. This girl's identity was not ordinary. She was Ku He's last disciple and had taken Haitang's place. She moved into Haitang's garden and collected her seeds. She was Fan Xian's sister. The quiet, cultivating disciples in the mountains were incomparably shocked. They didn't understand why the patriarch would go all the way to the Qin kingdom to take a female disciple. They also didn't understand why he had to take Fan Xian's sister as a disciple. Who was Fan Xian? He was one of the most powerful young officials in the Qin kingdom. However, things had already happened. The disciples in the mountains could not change anything. They could only learn to accept it. After a long time, they became used to the young lady of the Fan family's existence. The Qing kingdom and Northern Qi were mortal enemies. Although they had been on an unprecedentedly friendly relationship these 2 years, the emotions rooted in the depths of people's hearts were difficult to remove. Thus, Fan Ruoro's initial days in Qing Mountain were not very smooth. No matter where she went, she was greeted by hostile gazes and whispered discussions behind her back. Fortunately, this girl did not care at all. Additionally, her personality was cold, so she did not notice other people's attitude. After a few months, the Tianyi Dao disciples finally realized that this disciple aunt's attitude was even colder than theirs. They couldn't help but find it boring. In reality, Fan Ruoro was very satisfied with her learning life in Northern Qi. There were many more smiles on her face than when she was in Jingdo. However, the northern Qi people did not understand this. After all, they did not know that the young lady of the Fan family had long had the nickname of the talented iceberg girl in the Qin kingdom. Fan Ruoro's happiness came from the relaxed environment and tense life. Imperial advisor Ku, he had only taught her some basic art of Tianyi Dao and gifted her a few scrolls of scriptures. He did not pay much attention to her. The rest of her time was spent studying medicine with her second disciple. This was one of the reasons she had come to Northern Qi. She used the medical skills she had learned to treat the poor people at the foot of the mountain. Her days were very fulfilling. The second disciple's name was Mu Peng. The names Ku he had given his disciples were all very interesting. Lang Tao, Hai Tang, Mu Peng, Bai Shen. They were all names of plant. People were like their names. Lang Tao was like the literal feeling. His entire body was filled with killing intent and sharpness. Hai Tang stood gently and firmly in the wind and rain. Mu Peng was a traditional Chinese medicine. One could imagine what Ruoro's 40-year-old second disciple was best at. Fan Ruoro picked up the leaves and collected the dew on the pine leaves beside the courtyard. Tilting her head slightly, she poured the water into the dripping bottle. She was curious. Why did the prescription use dew? She carried Ping Er out of the courtyard and walked up the stone steps toward the mountain, preparing to carry out her daily studies. Along the way, she saw some young Tianyi Dao disciples. When these disciples saw the girl holding the bottle, they all stood to the side and bowed in greeting. For one, she was their disciple aunt. After a few months, the Tianyi Dao disciples knew that although this young lady of the Fan Manor's personality was cold, her heart was truly kind and did not pretend to be fake. She was much better than the Fan Xian in the south, who was gentle on the outside but vicious on the inside. In particular, this young lady of the Fan Manor had gone down the mountain tirelessly to treat the common people for many months. This made these junior disciples deeply respect her virtue. Fan Ruoro nodded her head slightly in return. There was no expression on her face. When she climbed up the long stone steps and stood at the top of the mountain, she stopped and looked at the lush green forest at the foot of the mountain. Suddenly, she stretched her waist and let out a loud cry. Her cheeks were flushed red from exercising, and she was a little excited. She had been born with a lack of nutrition since childhood. Although her brother had taken care of her for a while, there was no fundamental improvement. When she was in Jingdo, her face was always pale. Now, a healthy red rose to her face. One could imagine that after living in northern Qi for more than a year, her body was much better. One's constitution came from one's heart. It was mainly because of one's relaxed mood. I don't have to participate in boring poetry gatherings. I don't have to go to the manors of the nobles to chat with the women. I don't have to be like those sisters who hide behind a screen and look at men. I don't have to do needlework every day. Fan Ruoro gazed in a daze at the mountain below the stone steps. A happy smile rose to her face. This kind of life is what I want. Thank you, brother. Other than the heart of Tianyi Dao cultivation, there was also scripture and righteousness. Basically, they used the curriculum that Master Zhuang Mohan had personally revised. Fan Ruoro finished her 2 hours of cultivation and came to Mu Peng's room. She bowed respectfully and then asked a few difficult questions in medical skills for her second brother's guidance. Mu Peng said a few words and suddenly saw the joy in the girl's eyes. He smiled slightly and said, "Sir Fan Jr. has written again?" Fan Ruoro smiled and nodded. "Although it hasn't come yet, counting the days, it should be here." Mu Peng scratched his slightly disheveled hair and smiled. "You are so happy. Presumably, your relationship with your brother and sister is very good. Since it is so, why don't you stay in the Qin kingdom? Although northern Qi is good, it is, after all, a foreign country." Although Mu Peng's status could not compare to the old poison in the Overwatch Council, regardless of whether it was a doctor or a major figure who used poison, his hair seemed to be messy. His daily life was messy, so he did not notice things like dressing up. Fan Ruoro smiled slightly and replied, "It doesn't matter where." Brother said that in one's life, one must always make some sacrifices for the goal one wants. Mu Prung asked in surprise, "Oh? Then, what is your goal?" "To save people," Fan Ruoro replied calmly. "It's that simple?" "Yes." Mu Prung was silent for a moment and then said, "A doctor has the heart of a parent. But, when you first came to Northern Qi, you only listened for a while in the Imperial Academy of Medicine in the Qin court. Why do you have such a great wish?" "Brother, it's not because of the wish, but because of what I want." Fan Ruoro didn't think further and calmly said, "Brother once said, how should a person live their life? The first thing is to make one's state of mind happy. Treating people and saving people makes me happy, so I made this choice." How should a person live their life? Mu Prung furrowed his brows slightly and sighed. He didn't say anything more. He was thinking, what kind of person was that Fan family boy who could make Fan Haidang lose her composure? It was not yet dusk. Fan Ruoro carried the empty water bottle down the stone steps and returned to her little courtyard. She carefully tended to the herbs in the garden. Then, she walked back into the quiet room and began to prepare pen and paper. The furnishings in the room had not changed at all. She knew that this was, after all, Haitong's old residence. For the Northern Qi people, it had a different meaning. A letter was placed quietly on the table. A glimmer of joy flashed through Fan Ruoro's eyes. She hurriedly opened the letter and looked closely at the familiar fine handwriting on it. As she read the letter, her expression changed endlessly. Sometimes it was nervous, sometimes it was happy, and sometimes it was faintly sad. The letter had been sent by Fan Xian. He had used a great deal of effort to send his sister to Northern Qi's Tianyi Dao. The two of them were separated by a great distance, so it was not convenient for them to exchange messages. They each missed each other in their own places. Thus, after Ruoro settled down, Fan Xian immediately resumed his monthly letter home. As a child, Ruoro had returned to Jingdo from Danzhou at a young age. Ever since Ruoro could read and write, Fan Xian had begun to correspond with her. Using the Qin kingdom's developed postal routes, the brother and sister's letters came and went between Jingdo and Danzhou, rain or shine, one letter a month without stopping until the 4th year of the Qin calendar, when Fan Xian entered Jingdo. No one knew how many years they had been writing letters. These letters contained a great deal of affection between the brother and sister. In the letters they talked about the Red Chamber, the affairs of the manor, and the scenery and people of the two places. They talked about trivial family matters, and so on and so forth. It was through these letters that Fan Xian became one of his sister's teachers in terms of spirit. From a young age, Fan Ruoro had been influenced by the contents of these letters. Her state of mind and attitude was different from most women in this world. No, it was different from most people in this world. She was still filial to her parents, loved her brothers, and got along very well with her sisters in the boudoir. However, there were many different things in her heart. She had a relatively independent personality and yearning for freedom. She was so incompatible with this world, yet she did not want to leave this world and live. It was because of this contradiction that, when she was in Jingdo, she became a polite, cold girl. It was only later in front of Fan Xian that she dared to reveal her true feelings. Thus, she went far away to a foreign country and lived a simple and bitter life. This kind of life, unusually terrifying in the eyes of a noble lady, made her happy and content. The beginning of all of this was a letter. It was a letter between Fan Xian and her. Fan Ruoro looked at the letter in a daze. After a long time, she let out a faint sigh. The rims of her eyes were slightly moist. The struggles in court in Jingdo were still very far from her. She also believed in her father and brother's abilities, so she did not care about the dangers written in the letter. However, this time, Fan Xian mentioned Hongqing in the letter. Hongqing Fan Ruoro wiped away the tears at the corners of her eyes. The image of the gentle air rose in her mind. He was going to the west to fight the Hu people. Would he get hurt? Would he come back? King Jing's manor and the Fan manor were old friends. Ruoro had also grown up with Li Hongqing. She knew that although he had great ambitions, he was, by nature, a very rare good person. Putting aside the romantic affairs on the pleasure boats, he was also infatuated with her. This time, Hongqing had asked to leave the capital. One reason was to free himself from the struggle between the princes in Jingdo. She knew that this was also a kind of self-exile after she had hurt him. However, Fan Ruoro was unable to accept Hongqing. Her exquisite heart, which had been influenced by Fan Xian, was even more unable to accept this world's attitude toward men and women than Fan Xian himself. Isn't this a very ridiculous and interesting thing to do? Of course, even if there were no romantic affairs on the pleasure boats, even if Hongqing was a perfect person, Fan Ruoro still could not accept living with that man for the rest of her life. It was just like one of the stories Fan Xian had told in his letter. Those were all very good, but she just didn't like it. What story did he write to make you cry? A lazy and clear voice came from the door of the room. Your brother is indeed very detestable in certain aspect. Fan Ruoro raised her head to see Haitang standing at the door wearing a thin flowery dress. She quickly stood up and said, "So it was you who sent the letter. I thought it was someone sent by Sir Wang." Haitang put her hands in her clothes and dragged her feet in. "Wang Qinian isn't coming back. Didn't Fan Xian say? Right now, it's Deng Ziyu in Shangjing. You should have met him." Fan Ruoro nodded. Haitang smiled slightly and said, "I am truly curious about the contents of this letter. It actually made the usually calm you cry." Fan Ruoro's fingers gripped the letter. She lowered her head and said, "Don't make fun of me. Brother is still as long-winded as before." Haitang sighed and said, "I have experienced this deeply." Fan Ruoro tilted her head slightly and asked with confusion, "Aren't you in Shangjing? Why have you returned to the mountain?" Of course, Haitang couldn't have returned to the mountain just to send a letter to Fan Xian's sister. She gazed at Fan Ruoro and smiled slightly. "Teacher received a letter from second brother and thinks you can already leave the mountain. He had me accompany you to Shangjing." "Go to Shangjing," Fan Ruoro said with some difficulty. "But there are still many things I haven't learned." "It's just that someone wants to see you, so he asked me to take you there," Haitang said. "If you like life in the mountains, you can come back when the time comes." "Don't you also like life in the mountains?" Fan Ruoro smiled. "I didn't touch this room. I'll keep it. When the time comes, we'll live together." Hearing these words, Haitang sank into silence. After a long time, she sighed and said helplessly, "Even if I wanted to come back, it wouldn't be a matter of a year or two." Fan Ruoro knew that Haitang and her brother had been secretly doing something. Originally, with Fan Xian acting as a bridge between them, her relationship with Haitang had always been good. Furthermore, they spoke more casually. However, each time she thought of her sister-in-law, Lin Wan'er, far away in Qin Kingdom, Fan Ruoro purposely kept her distance from Haitang. Perhaps this was a girl's careful thoughts. She suddenly thought of the words earlier and asked curiously, "In Shangjing, who wants to see me?" "Your Majesty." A glimmer of a smile rose to the corners of Haitang's lips. She thought that her emperor's thoughts were as difficult to guess as Fan Xian's. In Shangjing, not far from Qing Mountain, where Tianyi Taoist School was located, in the black and green, unique and beautiful royal palace, the Master of the North, the Northern Qi Emperor, sat paralyzed on a low couch. His large feet were covered in cloth socks and gave off steam. His body was slanted in the arms of a beautiful woman in palace attire. Chapter 511. I don't think I did anything last summer. Lily held her head in her hands and felt a headache coming on. Ever since Fan Xian had mentioned this in his letter to Duoduo, the Northern Qi Emperor and the two women beside him had sunk into endless thought. No matter how they calculated, they could not figure out exactly what they had done to Fan Xian last summer. There was only one sentence in the letter. It was plainly written. It was like a warning, but it was more like a threat. The North did not understand just what had made Fan Xian so angry. They did not think that the reason for all of this was because Fan Xian had miscalculated the year. His original intention had been to warn the women in the north that he already knew about the matter of the broken temple. The Northern Qi Emperor furrowed his brows and coldly said, "Last year, I gave him a good sword through Wang Qinyan's hand. Even if he saw through this matter, it's fine if he doesn't thank me. Why did he send a letter to threaten the ant disciple? The Wei Emperor's sword?" Lily covered her mouth and smiled brightly. Or the Wei Emperor's sword. The pronunciation was the same. It took some time for the Northern Qi Emperor to understand this naughty joke. However, he didn't smile. On the contrary, his expression was slightly dark. Lily's heart jumped. She knew the Emperor didn't like her to be too presumptuous, so she quietly closed her mouth and knelt to the side. The Northern Qi Emperor slowly sat up. His hands moved back from his temples and tied up his long black hair. His 2 strokes of handsome brows straightened. Calmly, he said, "Let's not talk about this for now. Fan Xizha has a large banquet tonight. I will have Wei Hua attend in my place. What do you think?" "Your Majesty is wise." Lily thought for a moment and then said seriously, "By tying the second son of the Fan family in Shangjing, Fan Xian will certainly behave himself in the south. Even if he has other thoughts, he has to think about his brother and sister." Speaking of sister, Ruoro disciple should have arrived today. The Northern Qi Emperor smiled and waved his hand. He was unspeakably free and at ease. "As for what you say, it is a lie. It's not that we can threaten Fan Xian by tying the Fan family children in Shangjing. It is that Fan Xian has sent his brother and sister to this country and wants us to be nannies." He huffed coldly and continued, "What kind of person is Fan Xian? Since he dared to send them, of course he isn't afraid that we will use them as hostages. Back then, Chun was so gentle and magnanimous in the palace. If you don't have any dealings with him, you won't know how sinister he is." Lily pursed her lips and smiled. But His Majesty still agreed. "I was talking about kidnapping, not taking hostages. Fan Ruoro and Fan Xizha are doing well in Northern Qi, and Fan Xian is in a good mood. In the future, perhaps he will come over one day." How could it be so simple? The Northern Qi Emperor smiled self-mockingly. "He is doing very well in the Qin kingdom. Now that Li Yunrui has lost power, no one dares to touch him at all. How could he give up the supreme power in his hands and come to me? As for his arrangements, it can only mean that he is as sensitive and suspicious as his old emperor. A crafty rabbit has 3 burrows. He only sees my country as a path of retreat for his family." He sighed. He just had to be born in Jiangnan and in the palace treasury of the Qin kingdom. I need him for too many things. Even though I know he is using me, I can only agree. Within a year, the Northern Qi Emperor and Fan Xian had each chosen a spokesperson. They began to use the route the Chui family had used in the past, through Xia Mingji and Fan Xizha, and began to endlessly smuggle goods to the north. Both sides reaped great benefits. In order to prevent the Qing Emperor from becoming suspicious, the matter was done in great secrecy. Even if it was discovered, it would not implicate these high-level figures. However, the two sides were already tied together. That was why Fan Xian was at ease to have his sister-in-law stay in Northern Qi. His earlier words were correct. The Northern Qi Emperor was the good nanny Fan Xian had found. Furthermore, Fan Xian had already guessed the matter in the broken temple. When he used the Northern Qi Emperor, he was even less polite. Why would Fan Xian leave a path of retreat? Si Lily asked with confusion. Does he always think that the Qing kingdom is not a place where he will live for long? This is what I am most interested in. The Northern Qi Emperor smiled. Just what kind of person is Fan Xian? In the process of climbing up in the Qing kingdom, he has begun to look for a path of retreat. Does he think that one day, he will have a falling out with his emperor? It's really a little inexplicable. He paused and then continued. Do you still remember the time he sent you back to the capital? Si Lily immediately thought of their gentle interactions on the north and the boundless spring in the carriage. Her face heated slightly. She lowered her head and didn't reply. The Northern Qi Emperor laughed loudly. However, there was a slight sourness in the laughter. He used his finger to raise Si Lily's chin and gently said, Lily, I don't like you by my side thinking about other men. Si Lily lowered her head and didn't say anything. Her red lips held a smile. The Northern Qi Emperor huffed coldly. He found that this girl was becoming less and less afraid of him. He pulled his hand back and said, Didn't you once say that on the road back north, Fan Xian had given you an antidote? Since that is the case, he has saved both your lives and mine. That is why I don't understand. He cooperated with me for his own benefit. That is a matter for the future. Before this, it seemed that he didn't want me to die. Additionally, there is the matter of a path of retreat earlier. His brows were furrowed tightly. He could not understand it no matter how he thought about it. Fan Xian, does he really think of himself as a person of the Qing kingdom? Si Lily slowly raised her head and smiled slightly at the worried emperor. She didn't say that when Fan Xian was still in Shangjing, he had already guessed that the emperor would not be harmed by the poison in his body. Although she was now a royal concubine and deeply loved by the Northern Qi Emperor, in addition to the unclear relationship between them, and deep in the palace, she did not care at all about the threat from the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council. She also did not need to accept Fan Xian's remote control. For some reason, whenever she thought of the young man's hateful and gentle smile in the south, Si Lily's heart softened and hid much for him. Perhaps it was to see how the emperor, who had always been far-sighted, would fly into a rage in the future? The Qing kingdom is a great enemy of our dynasty. The Northern Qi Emperor furrowed his brows and said, I have a clear understanding of the beast-like thoughts of the Qing people. Even if Fan Xian has endless hatred toward the Qing royal family because of the Yi family matter, he is, after all, a person of the Qing kingdom. Why would he give me, this court so many benefits? Is he not afraid that once the Qi kingdom falls, it will make the Qing kingdom look bad? Hearing these words, Si Lily stopped her playful thoughts and sank into silence. She was a descendant of the Qing royal family and had an irreconcilable hatred with the Qing court. That was why she had turned to Northern Qi. However, Fan Xian was, after all, the illegitimate child of the Qing emperor. Although the Qing emperor had many restrictions on him, in 3 short years, he had made him the most powerful official in the Qing court. What was there for Fan Xian to be dissatisfied with? Why would he secretly make so many deals with Northern Qi? It couldn't be because of her, Si Lily thought self-mockingly. It also couldn't be because of Duo, much less the emperor. Although Fan Xian was a lustful person, he would not change his mind because of a woman. After she was silent for a long time, a thought suddenly flashed through her mind. Unless, he has never truly considered himself a person of the Qing kingdom. After saying this, she shook her head. Even she didn't believe these words. A strange light flashed through the Northern Qi Emperor's eyes. Immediately after, a faint disappointment rose. If Fan Xian truly did not consider himself a person of the Qing kingdom, then perhaps one day he would actually come to Northern Qi. If Fan Xian came, he would bring countless benefits, such as the secrets of the palace treasury, the internal affairs of the Overwatch Council, and his identity. a prince of the Qin kingdom, a successor that Zhuang Mohan had appointed to betray the Qin kingdom and come to northern Qi. What kind of shock would this cause? How much benefit and danger would this bring to northern Qi? If Fan Xian truly came to join, the ambitious northern Qi emperor would certainly accept him regardless of the danger. However, he knew that this kind of speculation was impossible. Everyone knew that Fan Xian was a Qing person through and through. The Qing emperor would not be so stupid as to force his most promising son to not live on and take that last step. In reality, it was just that the people of this world could not understand the thinking of Fan Xian, a modern person. Ever since Fan Xian had said those words in the cave, he had already accepted his role as a person of this era. However, he did not have much of a sense of family and country. Because of the environment he had grown up in and the friends he had around him, his feelings toward the Qin kingdom were even deeper. In his view, the disputes of the world were actually just a kind of internal dispute, like the eldest branch fighting the second branch. It was like the spring and autumn period or the warring states period. There was no sense of moral shame in jumping around. The concept of treason had never existed in his mind. This was the unique mentality of outsiders. Walking up the quiet stone path of the royal palace in Shangjing, the eunuchs and serving girls opening the way carefully supported the young man at the side, terrified that the young man in the dragon robe would accidentally fall. The eunuchs holding the horsetail whisks and water bottles behind him stood on their tiptoes and lowered their heads, not daring to make a single sound. The expression of the northern Qi emperor was not very good. Ever since he was young, he hated having these servants around him, making it a rare opportunity for him to relax. However, the rules in the palace had always been like this. No matter how angry he was, he could not change this unless he killed all of these servants. But what could he do even if he killed them all? Walking to the side of the third floor of the palace, a green tree slowly lowered its branches and gently rested on the black eaves. It was a beautiful contrast. The little emperor looked at this scene in a daze. He wondered why he rarely noticed these sights when he wandered around the palace every day. Was it because he saw so much every day that he habitually forgot? He suddenly remembered what Haitang had once told him. The Qin kingdom man imitated Haitang in walking in the palace. The man seemed to walk happily. His eyes moved quickly and greedily. It was as if he wanted to take in all of the beautiful scenery in the palace. Did that man naturally like beautiful things, which was why he could write such beautiful and clean words? The northern Qi emperor lowered his head. With his hands behind his back, he sank deep into thought. A moment later, he raised his head. A confident smile hung on his face. His feet changed direction and headed toward a mountain path to his right. At the end of the mountain path, the sound of a waterfall could faintly be heard. The eunuchs and serving girls beside him jumped in fright. Wasn't the emperor going to the summit to plant osmanthus? Why did he turn in that direction? No one dared to make a sound to stop him. They could only follow silently. The mountain path turned a few times and came to a platform by the cliff. There was a pavilion on the platform. The northern Qi emperor pointed at the pavilion. The eunuchs and serving girls at his side immediately rushed over. They set down the garden stools, lit incense, and swept away the dust. The emperor walked into the pavilion and looked at the stream below the pavilion and the spring flowers facing the cliff. His heart jumped slightly. In a quiet voice, he recited, slapping the railing, "The flowers in the forest blow at my temples, the mountain wind is cold, the grand song startles the floating clouds away." The people beside him hurriedly flattered, "Your Majesty." The northern Qi emperor smiled self-mockingly. He thought of how Fan Xian had only said 3 words to him in this pavilion, good words. To flatter me so carelessly. Fan Xian, you are still the only one. The northern Qi emperor smiled. Standing by the railing, he looked at the beautiful scenery of his world. Everyone retreat. Everyone retreat, he suddenly ordered. The eunuchs and serving girls in the pavilion looked at each other. The mountain rocks were cold. If the emperor caught a cold, how would they explain it to the Empress Dowager? They knew that northern Qi was the emperor's country. Although the emperor was young, his will was unusually firm. After Shenzhong's death, the emperor had strongly advocated for Shang Shanhu to be released to the south to fight against the Qin kingdom. He had also presided over a few major changes in the court. Even the officials did not dare to look at him as if he were a child. The pavilion immediately returned to its usual peace and quiet. The northern Qi emperor stood by the railing and took a deep breath. Thinking of Fan Xian's suggestion at the beginning, he thought that this kid was right. A moment later, he thought of another matter. His brows slowly furrowed. In a quiet voice, he said to himself, Fan Xian, what exactly do you think? First worry about the worries of the world, and then rejoice in the world's happiness? This world, is it the Qin kingdom's world, or the entire world? The northern Qi emperor's brows gradually relaxed. He faintly sensed the truth of the situation. The corners of his lips twitched up in a rare manner. A strange smile appeared on his face. In a quiet voice, he said, If you come to join me, I will make you a prince. That is at least a bit better than your current little duke. Take a day off tomorrow. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.